Before we begin, take a moment to settle. Let your breathing slow, find a comfortable position, and allow yourself to sink into stillness. This is a story about cold nights and the small acts that made warmth possible. It unfolds across the Great Plains in winter, in a time when sleep required preparation, when rest was not given but earned through ritual. The people in this story lived in a landscape that offered no natural shelter. They slept under open sky, on frozen ground, with only wool and canvas between themselves and the cold. Their nights were shaped by wind and silence, by the weight of buffalo robes and the glow of banked embers. They learned to turn procedural tasks, laying a ground sheet, wrapping a heated stone, banking a fire with ash, into acts of care and protection. This is not a story of dramatic survival or extraordinary heroism. It is a story of ordinary endurance, repeated night after night across decades of westward movement and settlement. It is about families sleeping beneath wagons, cowboys wrapped in bedrolls on the open range, homesteaders curled in dugouts carved from earth. It is about the rhythm of evening preparation and the quiet victory of waking to frost-covered morning. There is no urgency here. The story moves at the pace of those long nights, steady, deliberate, unhurried. We will follow the logic of cold, how it shaped decisions, how it demanded attention, how people learned to meet it with layers and ritual and small repeated acts of determination. We will see how warmth was found not in abundance but in careful preservation, not in comfort but in sufficiency. So settle in, let the outside world fade. What follows is a gentle journey through winter on the American frontier, through the practical wisdom of sleeping in a horizontal frozen world. The story begins not with people, but with the land itself, the ocean of grass in winter. The Great Plains in winter were not like other cold places. They were a world stripped to its essential elements, earth, sky, and the space between. When winter came to the prairie, the transformation was total. The grasses that had stood tall and green through summer became brittle and frozen. They snapped underfoot. They rattled in the wind like dried reeds. The colour drained from the land, leaving only shades of brown and grey, punctuated by white when snow fell. This was a horizontal world. There were no mountains to break the wind, no forests to provide timber, no hills high enough to offer perspective. The land stretched in every direction until it met the sky, and the line where they joined was perfectly flat. Travellers described it as an ocean, and the comparison was apt. Like an ocean, the prairie was vast and featureless. Like an ocean, it could turn hostile without warning. And like an ocean, it made those who crossed it feel very small. The absence of trees was the defining fact of prairie life. Trees meant shelter. They broke the force of wind. They provided fuel for fires. They offered shade in summer and windbreaks in winter. Without them, the prairie became a place of pure exposure. A person standing alone on the winter plains was visible for miles. There was nowhere to hide, no natural enclosure to retreat into. The wind had nothing to slow it down. This wind was not the occasional gust that might blow through a forest or a town. It was a constant presence, a force that shaped every decision. It blew from the north, steady and cold, carrying the chill of Arctic air across hundreds of miles of open land. It found every gap in clothing, every seam in a wagon's canvas cover, every crack in a hastily built shelter. Pioneers wrote about it obsessively in their journals and letters. They described it as searching, as persistent, as something alive. The wind did not just blow around them, it blew through them. In a place with natural barriers, buildings, trees, hills, wind can be blocked. It becomes localized, something to avoid or shelter from. On the prairie, wind was omnipresent. It pressed against faces until skin went numb. It pulled heat from bodies with ruthless efficiency. It made the simple act of standing still feel like work. The temperature itself was often severe. Winter nights on the plains could drop to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the hardest winters they fell much lower. But the number on a thermometer told only part of the story. A still cold night at 0 was survivable. A person could wrap themselves in blankets, huddle near a fire, and wait for dawn. But when the wind blew, and it almost always blew, the experience of cold changed entirely. The human body generates heat continuously. In still air, This heat creates a thin, insulating layer around the skin. Wind strips that layer away, forcing the body to generate heat faster than it can in calm conditions. A 0-degree night with a 20-mile-per-hour wind feels like 22 degrees below zero. The body loses heat at the same rate it would in truly sub-zero temperatures. Pioneers did not have the term wind chill, but they understood the phenomenon intimately. They knew that a calm, cold day was manageable. A windy, cold day was dangerous. They planned their travel and their camps around the wind. They learned to read its patterns, to anticipate when it might shift or intensify. They developed a respect for it that bordered on fear. The prairie also taught another lesson about cold, its variability. The weather could change with shocking speed. This was especially true of a phenomenon settlers came to dread, the blue norther. The name came from the distinctive appearance of the storm front. On a day that might be calm, even unseasonably warm, a dark line would appear on the northern horizon. It was a deep blue-black, a wall of cloud that stretched from ground to sky. When pioneers saw this line, they moved quickly. They knew what was coming. The blue norther was a fast-moving cold front, and it brought not just cold, but a sudden, violent drop in temperature. In a matter of minutes, sometimes less than an hour, the air could plummet 30, 40 or 50 degrees. An afternoon that had been mild enough for shirt sleeves would snap into a hard, dangerous freeze. These temperature drops caught travellers and livestock in the open. There was no time to build shelter or find protected ground. Cattle would turn their backs to the wind and hunker down where they stood. Cowboys would wrap themselves in whatever they had and try to endure. Wagon trains would circle quickly, families scrambling to secure canvas and gather children. The blue norther was not just cold, it was cold delivered with such speed that preparation became impossible. On nights when the wind stopped, and occasionally it did, the prairie revealed a different character. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not simply the absence of sound, it was a heavy crystalline quiet that seemed to press down from the sky. In this silence, small sounds became magnified. The snap of a frozen twig could carry for miles. The crack of ice forming on a shallow creek was loud enough to wake sleepers. The distant howl of a wolf, lonely and plaintive, could be heard from ridges far away. This silence made the vastness of the land more apparent. During the day, the eye could measure distance by the horizon, by the slow passage of clouds, by the movement of other travellers. At night, with stars stretching in every direction and no artificial light to interrupt them, the sense of space became overwhelming. The prairie did not just surround a person, it seemed to swallow them. The visual experience of the prairie in winter carried its own disorientation. The horizon was always visible, always equidistant in every direction. This created a strange effect on perception. Distances became difficult to judge. A stand of cottonwoods along a creek bed might appear close, easily reachable by afternoon. But after hours of walking, the trees seemed no nearer. The flatness eliminated the usual visual cues that humans use to estimate distance. No change in elevation, no objects of known size to provide reference. This deceptive distance frustrated travellers and sometimes led to dangerous decisions. A wagon train might decide to push on to reach what appeared to be nearby shelter, only to find themselves still travelling as darkness fell. The goal that had seemed an hour away remained on the horizon, unreachable. Experienced wagon masters learned to distrust their eyes, to calculate distance by time rather than by appearance. The frozen grass itself had a particular character in moonlight. On clear nights, when a full or nearly full moon rose, the entire prairie would take on a silver-blue luminescence. The ice crystals that formed on each frozen blade caught and reflected moonlight, creating a landscape that seemed to glow from within. It was beautiful in a cold, alien way. But this beauty was paired with danger. The same clear sky that allowed moonlight also allowed heat to radiate away from the earth, making such nights among the coldest. The psychological effect of the flatness was cumulative. Days or weeks of seeing nothing but horizon in every direction created a sense of placelessness. There were no landmarks to mark progress, no mountains appearing larger as one approached, no valley opening up ahead. Each morning looked like the previous morning, each evening like the previous evening. This sameness wore on the mind. Some pioneers described a kind of disorientation, a feeling that they were not moving at all, but rather that the prairie was sliding beneath them like a treadmill. Others spoke of feeling watched, of sensing the vastness pressing in on them despite the openness. Still others found the endless horizon peaceful, meditative, a landscape that encouraged internal rather than external focus. The timing of travel across the plains was carefully considered by those who had a choice. Late spring and early fall were preferred. Temperatures were moderate, grass was available for livestock, water sources were reliable, summer brought heat and sometimes drought. Winter brought the cold that tested every aspect of survival. But many families did not have the luxury of choosing their timing. Circumstances, economic need, family situations, weather delays earlier in the journey meant that some wagon trains found themselves crossing the plains in late fall or even early winter. These families knew they were racing against the weather. Each day of travel was a day closer to their destination, but also a day deeper into the cold season. The question was always, would they reach the mountains before the snow came? Would they cross the plains before the worst cold set in? These calculations were made daily, weighing current conditions against projected arrival dates, balancing the need for speed against the need to preserve the health of animals and people. There were no guarantees. The weather was unpredictable. The distance was fixed. All that could be controlled was the daily pace, and even that was limited by the endurance of the oxen pulling the wagons. Into this landscape, frozen, windswept, silent and vast, came four people who needed to sleep. They needed rest in a place that offered no natural shelter. They needed warmth in a place where fuel was scarce. They needed safety in a place where exposure was constant. The prairie did not care whether they succeeded. It simply was. And so the question became not whether the prairie was hostile, but how a person might learn to sleep within it. The wind that found everything. The pioneers who travelled across the Great Plains developed an intimate vocabulary for wind. They wrote about it in letters home, in diary entries, in passing comments recorded by journalists and travellers. The wind was not background noise. It was a character in their daily lives, something they named and described with precision. There was the steady wind, the gusting wind, the moaning wind. There was wind that came in the morning and wind that rose at dusk. There was wind that carried dust and wind that carried snow. What made prairie wind particularly challenging was its constancy. In forested regions or near mountains, wind shifts and eddies. It moves through valleys, gets disrupted by terrain, creates pockets of calm. On the Great Plains, it blew unobstructed. There were days when it never stopped. Not for an hour, not for 10 minutes. It blew all night and into the next day. This unbroken wind created a physical exhaustion that went beyond mere cold. The body had to work continuously to maintain warmth. Muscles tensed against the chill. The respiratory system worked harder to warm incoming air. Energy reserves depleted faster. A person could eat a full meal and still feel hungry an hour later, because their body was burning calories simply standing in place. The wind also created a psychological weight. The constant sound, a low moan, a whistle through canvas, a rhythmic buffeting became mentally wearing. Sleep became difficult even when a person was exhausted. The noise kept the mind alert, waiting for a change in pitch that might signal danger. Parents learned to distinguish between normal wind sounds and the sounds that meant canvas was tearing, or a wagon cover was coming loose, or livestock were becoming agitated. Clothing offered some protection, but only if it was layered correctly and maintained carefully. A wool coat kept warmth close to the body. A canvas outer layer blocked some of the wind's direct force, but any gap became a point of heat loss. A loose button meant cold air could enter at the chest. An improperly tied scarf left the neck exposed. Mittens were warmer than gloves because fingers could share heat, but they made detailed work impossible. Pioneers learned to work quickly when bare hands were necessary, then thrust them back into warmth before numbness set in. The wind shaped the architecture of prairie life. Wagons were positioned with their backs to prevailing winds. Tents, when used, were staked with the entrance facing away from the north. Even the arrangement of bedding reflected wind patterns. A family would note which direction the wind came from most consistently and place the heaviest sleeper, usually the father, on that side, creating a human windbreak for children and smaller family members. Canvas wagon covers, which seemed substantial during calm weather, revealed their limitations in strong wind. The fabric snapped and popped. It billowed inward, then sucked outward. Tie-downs had to be checked constantly. A loose corner could begin to flap, and once flapping started, the fabric would tear. Repairing canvas in cold weather was difficult. Fingers went numb quickly. Thread became stiff. Needles were hard to grip. The wind also carried moisture away from any damp surface with remarkable speed. This had both advantages and disadvantages. Wet clothing dried faster, which was good. But the body lost moisture through breath and perspiration, and in strong wind, dehydration became a concern. Water sources froze solid, making drinking water scarce. Snow could be melted, but that required fuel and time. Pioneers learned to drink more than felt necessary, recognizing that thirst was an unreliable indicator in cold, dry air. At night, when families settled into their sleeping spaces beneath wagons or inside rough shelters, the wind's presence was inescapable. It found every seam in a canvas ground sheet. It discovered gaps around wagon wheels. It pushed cold air down through any opening in overhead covers. The small bubble of warmth that a family tried to maintain was under constant siege. The psychological impact of this siege should not be understated. There was no moment of complete security. Even inside the best shelter available on the prairie, the wind could be heard and felt. It was a reminder that the environment was not benign, that warmth was temporary, that vigilance was necessary. Parents lay awake listening to the wind's pitch change, wondering if it was building toward a more dangerous storm. Children woke in the night when a particularly strong gust hit their canvas roof. The wind also carried sound in strange ways. Voices travelled farther than seemed possible. A conversation from one wagon could be heard clearly at another wagon 50 yards away. This meant privacy was difficult. Families learned to speak quietly, to keep personal matters truly personal. But it also meant that help could be called for if needed. A cry of distress would reach other members of the wagon train. Some winds were worse than others. A steady, moderate wind was manageable. The body adjusted to it. Clothing and shelter could be arranged to minimize its effect. But gusty wind was different. It came in surges, hitting hard, then dropping away, then hitting again. This made it impossible to find a stable defensive posture. What worked during a calm moment failed when the next gust arrived. Cold wind at dawn was particularly harsh. Bodies were at their lowest temperature after a night of sleep. Metabolism was slow. When a person emerged from blankets into wind-driven cold, the shock was total. The first few minutes of morning activity were an exercise in willpower. Tasks had to be done. Fires needed rebuilding, animals needed tending, breakfast needed preparation. But every movement felt difficult. The wind's persistence also meant that shelter was not something built once and forgotten. It required constant maintenance. Tie-downs loosened, stakes worked free from frozen ground. Canvas developed small tears that became large tears if not repaired immediately. Part of the evening routine was checking every point of attachment, every seam, every anchor. This was not optional. A shelter that failed during the night could mean death. The cumulative exhaustion of weeks under constant wind was real and measurable. Pioneers who had crossed the plains in windy seasons often arrived at their destinations noticeably more worn than those who had travelled in calmer weather. The constant cold stress depleted the body's reserves. Energy that should have gone to building strength or fighting illness was consumed simply maintaining body temperature against the wind. Children experienced wind differently than adults. Their smaller bodies had less thermal mass and lost heat more quickly. They tired faster in the wind. They needed more frequent breaks from exposure. Parents learned to watch children carefully for signs of excessive cold, unusual quietness, stumbling, disorientation. These could indicate that a child's core temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. Regional variations in wind patterns became apparent to those who travelled extensively across the plains. The Kansas plains had different wind characteristics than the Nebraska territory. Wyoming winds behaved differently than those in the Dakotas. Some areas experienced more frequent gusts. Others had steadier but more persistent winds. Experienced travellers shared this knowledge, warning newcomers about particularly wind-prone stretches of trail. The wind also affected when certain tasks could be accomplished. Cooking over an open fire in high wind was nearly impossible. Flames blew marrow out, ash scattered into food, heat dissipated before pots could warm. Wagon canvas repairs couldn't be done in strong wind. The fabric had to be held taut for stitching, which required calm conditions. Even simple tasks like pouring water or measuring flour became difficult when wind constantly disrupted the work. For all its challenges, pioneers learned to live with the wind. They learned to move efficiently despite it. They learned to communicate over its noise. They learned to read its moods and adjust accordingly. The wind became a known quantity, something to be respected and managed. It was never comfortable, it was never welcome, but it was always there, and so it became part of the rhythm of prairie life. The ability to endure it, to sleep despite it, to wake and continue in its presence, this was not exceptional. It was simply necessary. The problem of fuel, fire was essential. It cooked food, boiled water for drinking and washing, provided light after dark, and generated the warmth needed to survive cold nights. But on the Great Plains, fire required fuel, and fuel was the resource most conspicuously absent. The prairie was an ocean of grass. In summer, that grass stood tall and green. In winter, it lay frozen and brown. But at no time of year was it wood. There were no forests to harvest, no stands of timber. In many regions, there were no trees at all. A wagon train could travel for days, seeing nothing taller than the grass itself. This absence of wood fundamentally changed how fire was obtained, maintained, and used. Pioneers had to rely on what they called prairie fuel. The primary source was buffalo chips, the dried droppings of bison. Before the great herds were decimated in the latter half of the 19th century, these chips were abundant. They lay scattered across the prairie, deposited by animals that moved in vast numbers across the grasslands. When dried by sun and wind, buffalo chips became surprisingly effective fuel. A well-dried chip burned hot. It generated consistent warmth. It produced minimal smoke, which was important inside confined spaces like wagon interiors or dugout shelters. It burned relatively quickly, which meant a fire needed frequent feeding, but it did burn completely, leaving fine ash that was easy to clean. Pioneers who had initially been skeptical, who found the idea distasteful or primitive, quickly learned to appreciate the chip's utility. The initial resistance to using buffalo chips was often mentioned in letters and diaries. Women especially wrote about their reluctance to handle animal droppings for cooking fires. The idea of preparing food over such fuel seemed unsanitary, uncivilized. But necessity overcame squeamishness. After a few days on the prairie with no alternative fuel source, the chips became simply another tool for survival. The transformation from repugnance to acceptance was swift. Pioneers discovered that well-dried chips were odorless. They were light and easy to handle. They left hands dusty but not soiled. The fire they produced was clean-burning, without the acrid smell that might be expected. Within a week of using chips regularly, most families stopped thinking of them as anything other than normal fuel. Collecting buffalo chips was usually assigned to children. It was one of the tasks young people could perform without much supervision. They would walk out from the camp or homestead with a basket or a bag, gathering chips from the surrounding area. The work was repetitive but not difficult. The chips were dry and lightweight. A child could collect enough to fuel a small cooking fire in less than an hour. The daily collection routine became part of the rhythm of prairie life. Children would head out in late afternoon when the day's travel had stopped, or when farm work allowed a break. They worked in pairs or small groups, spreading out across the area around camp. The task offered a kind of freedom, time away from adult supervision, opportunity to explore the immediate surroundings, a chance to talk and play while working. The distance travelled during collection varied. Close to a well-used trail where previous wagon trains had already picked the area clean, children might need to walk half a mile or more from camp to find adequate chips. In areas where bison had recently passed, chips might be abundant within a few hundred yards. The availability of chips was one factor in choosing where to make camp for the night. The quality of chips varied. Older, more weathered chips were best. They had dried thoroughly and burned cleanly. These chips were pale in colour, almost grey-white, and they crumbled easily if squeezed too hard. The texture was fibrous, showing the structure of digested grass. Weight was minimal. A chip that might be 6 inches across and 2 inches thick could weigh only a few ounces. Fresher chips contained more moisture and were less effective. They were darker in colour, heavier, and more compact. When placed on a fire, fresh chips would smoulder rather than burn, producing smoke and little heat. Experienced gatherers learned to avoid these, leaving them to dry naturally for future travellers, or for their own use if they remained in the area long enough. Chips that had been rained on were nearly useless until they dried again. Water saturated the fibrous structure. making the chips heavy and impossible to burn. A chip that had been soaked might take several days of sun and wind to become usable again. This meant that collection after rainy weather was more difficult, and families learned to gather extra chips when weather was dry, storing them in the wagon or under canvas to protect them from future rain. The size of chips varied based on the age and size of the animal that deposited them. Bull bison produced larger chips than cows or younger animals. Large chips were generally preferred because they provided more fuel per piece collected, reducing the labour required. But smaller chips had their uses too. They were good for kindling or for quick hot fires when time was short. Children developed a practiced eye for identifying good chips. They learned to spot them from a distance, to judge quality by colour and appearance, to select the best specimens efficiently. This knowledge was passed between children, older ones teaching younger siblings or new arrivals to the wagon train. It became a point of pride to return to camp with a basket of high-quality chips that would burn well. The quantity of chips needed varied by season and by the size of the group. A family of 4 might need a bushel basket of chips for a day's cooking, and overnight warmth in moderate weather. In deep winter, with longer hours of darkness and colder temperatures, the same family might need twice that amount. A wagon train of 20 families might collectively burn hundreds of pounds of chips daily. This consumption created its own challenge. A wagon train following a well-travelled route moved through an area that had been picked clean by previous travellers. The ground for miles around popular camping spots might be completely bare of chips. This forced later wagon trains to send collection parties farther from camp, or to make camp in less convenient locations where chips were still available. When buffalo chips were scarce, either because the area had been heavily picked over by previous travellers, or because bison had not been numerous in that region, pioneers turned to other sources. Twisted hay became an alternative, though it required more preparation and burned less efficiently. Prairie hay, when dry, could be twisted into tight bundles called cats. The process was simple but time-consuming. Handfuls of hay were gathered, then twisted and compressed until they formed dense cylindrical bundles. The twisting had to be tight. Loose hay would burn away in seconds, while tightly twisted hay burned more slowly and produced more heat per handful. The technique required practice. Too loose and the cat fell apart. Too tight and it became difficult to ignite. The right tightness came from experience, from learning how much pressure to apply during twisting, from understanding how the hay should feel when it was ready. Children and adults both could twist hay cats, though adults generally produced more uniform results. The task of twisting hay cats often fell to children or to whoever was available during slow periods of the day. It was monotonous work. Hands became sore from the repetitive twisting motion. The dry hay abraded skin and leaving fingers rough and sometimes cracked. The repetitive motion caused aching in wrists and forearms, but it was necessary. A family needed a steady supply of fuel to maintain even a small bubble of warmth in their shelter. The production rate for hay cats was slow. An adult working steadily might produce enough cats for 1 hour of fire in an hour of twisting. This meant that maintaining a fire through a long winter night might require 4 or 5 hours of preparation work. In homesteading situations where families stayed in one place, hay twisting became a regular evening activity. Family members would sit together, twisting hay while talking or singing, producing the next day's fuel supply. Storage of hay cats required some attention. They needed to be kept dry, which meant storing them inside the wagon, or dwelling, or under waterproof covering. They were bulky relative to their fuel value, taking up significant space. A day's supply of hay cats might fill a barrel or a large basket. For wagon travellers, this bulk was a problem. Space was limited, and every item had to justify its place. Hay cats burned quickly and needed constant replacement. A fire fed with hay cats required almost continuous attention. Someone had to be present to add new cats every few minutes. This made hay cats impractical for overnight fires or for any situation where the fire needed to burn unattended. They were adequate for cooking fires that would be actively managed, but they were a poor substitute for buffalo chips in most applications. The labour investment in hay cats was substantial enough that families tried to avoid relying on them. Buffalo chips, when available, were strongly preferred. Only when chips were truly unavailable did families turn to hay. This preference created a kind of informal economy around chips. Families or traders who had access to good chip-gathering areas might collect extra to trade with those who had less access. Some regions of the prairie had scattered wood along creek beds or river valleys. When wagon trains came across these rare wooded areas, they would stop and collect as much timber as they could carry. Every available space in a wagon might be filled with branches and logs. This wood was hoarded carefully, used sparingly. A piece of real firewood became a luxury, save for particularly cold nights or for times when cooking required sustained heat. The collection of wood when it was available was intense and thorough. Everyone in the wagon train would participate. Men with axes cutting branches, women and children gathering fallen wood, even small pieces of deadfall that might normally be ignored. The work would continue for hours, until wagons were loaded to capacity, or until the available wood was exhausted. This collected wood was distributed carefully over the following days or weeks. A family might use a single small branch to start a fire, then maintain it with buffalo chips or hay. Or they might save all their wood for one particularly cold night, when the extra heat would be most valuable. The presence of real wood became something to be noted in diaries and letters, a marker of relative abundance. The scarcity of fuel changed how fires were built and maintained. Large, roaring fires were wasteful. They consumed precious fuel too quickly. Instead, pioneers learned to build small, efficient fires. The goal was a concentrated bed of coals that radiated steady heat without producing large flames. This required attention and skill. Too much fuel smothered the fire. Too little let it die. The right balance produced a fire that could cook a meal and warm a small space without depleting the fuel supply. The size of the fire pit itself was typically small, often no more than 2 feet across. This concentrated heat in a small area, improving efficiency. The pit was usually scraped into the ground, creating a slight depression that protected the fire from wind and contained coals. Rocks might be arranged around the perimeter if available, providing additional heat retention and wind protection. Fire building technique became a subject of expertise. Some pioneers developed reputations as skilled fire builders, able to coax maximum heat from minimal fuel. Their techniques were observed and copied. They might be consulted when fuel was particularly scarce or when weather conditions made fire starting difficult. This knowledge had genuine value. A person skilled in fire management contributed meaningfully to group survival. Stoves, when available, improved fuel efficiency significantly. A small cast iron stove could heat a sod house or a dugout with far less fuel than an open fire. The metal absorbed and radiated heat. The enclosed design reduced heat loss. Dampers allowed control over airflow, which regulated burn rate. A well-managed stove could maintain warmth through a long night on a surprisingly small amount of fuel. The difference between stove and open fire in fuel consumption was dramatic. A stove might use 1/3 to 1/2 the fuel that an open fire required for equivalent heat. This meant that a family with a stove could get by on smaller daily collections of chips or cats. It meant that stored fuel lasted longer. It meant that less time was spent on fuel gathering and more time could be devoted to other necessary work. But stoves were heavy and expensive. Not every family had one. Those who did guarded them carefully. A stove was a major investment, comparable to buying quality livestock. It was one of the items most frequently mentioned in letters and diaries, a marker of relative prosperity and preparation. Stoves were sometimes shared between families in a wagon train, with cooking scheduled in shifts to allow multiple families access. The weight of a stove was significant. A small model might weigh 50 pounds, while a larger stove could weigh over 100. This weight had to be justified by the improved efficiency and comfort the stove provided. For wagon travellers, where every pound mattered for the animals pulling the wagon, the decision to carry a stove was carefully considered. For those without stoves, open fires required more fuel and more attention. Wind could blow embers out of a fire pit. Rain could extinguish flames. Snow could dampen wood or chips before they could be used. Keeping a fire going in adverse conditions was a challenge that tested patience and resourcefulness. The evening fire was particularly important. It cooked the last meal of the day. It provided warmth as temperatures dropped with the setting sun. It offered light when darkness came, and it served a psychological function. Fire was a focal point, a centre around which the family gathered, a symbol of home even in the most temporary camp. As night approached, the fire had to be managed carefully. The goal was not to keep it blazing until everyone slept. but to preserve heat in forms that would last. This meant transitioning from flame to coals. Wood or chips were allowed to burn down until they formed a deep bed of glowing embers. These embers produced intense heat without flames, and they could be preserved for hours. One technique was to heat the ground where bedding would be laid. A fire would be maintained in one spot for several hours, allowing heat to penetrate deep into the earth. Then, just before bedtime, the fire would be scraped aside, coals, ash and all, and moved to a new location. The family would lay their ground sheet and blankets on the spot where the fire had been. The earth itself, now saturated with warmth, acted as a heating pad, radiating stored heat upward for much of the night. Another technique involved hot rocks. Smooth stones were placed in the fire and left there for an hour or more. When heated thoroughly, a stone would be removed, brushed free of ash and wrapped in cloth or canvas. This wrapped stone could be placed at the foot of a bed, where it would provide localized warmth for hours. The cloth wrapping was essential. Direct contact with hot stone could burn skin or scorch blankets. The fire also had to be banked properly to preserve coals until morning. This was done by covering the remaining embers with a layer of ash. The ash cut off most of the oxygen supply, slowing combustion to a near stop. The coals beneath would continue to smoulder, staying hot without burning away. In the morning, the first person awake would dig through the ash pile, find the live coals, add tinder and fresh fuel, and coax the fire back to life. This banking technique was crucial. Starting a fire from scratch in freezing weather was difficult. Fingers went numb quickly. Tinder had to be dry, which was not always easy to ensure. Striking sparks with flint and steel took time and effort. But if coals had been preserved overnight, fire could be rekindled in minutes. A breath of air on buried embers would bring them back to glowing red. A handful of dry grass would ignite. Small twigs would catch. The fire would return. The management of fuel and fire was not dramatic, but it was constant. It required planning, attention, and labour. A family that ran out of fuel in the middle of winter faced genuine danger. They could not cook food. They could not warm their shelter. They could not melt snow for drinking water. Fuel scarcity made every fire precious and every flame something to be carefully tended. The seasonal variation in fuel availability created patterns in settlement and travel. Spring and fall, when weather was moderate and fuel needs were lower, were preferred times for travel. Deep winter, when fuel consumption was highest and collection was most difficult, was a time to stay put if possible. These patterns influenced the timing of wagon departures, the planning of cattle drives, and the rhythm of homestead life. The king of fabrics. In the hierarchy of materials available to prairie pioneers, wool stood supreme. It was not the softest fabric. It was not the lightest. It was not particularly easy to clean. But for sleeping in cold conditions, wool had properties that made it irreplaceable. The key advantage of wool was its ability to retain warmth even when damp. This was not simply a preference or a minor benefit. It was the difference between functional bedding and dangerous bedding. On cold nights, moisture was inevitable. Bodies perspired during sleep, breath condensed in cold air. Ground dampness seeped upward. Snow or frost could settle on exposed fabric. Cotton, when it became wet, lost most of its insulating ability. The fibres absorbed water which conducted heat away from the body. A damp cotton blanket became heavy and cold. It actively pulled warmth away rather than preserving it. Sleeping under wet cotton was worse than sleeping under nothing at all, because the fabric created the illusion of protection, while actually increasing heat loss. Wool behaved differently. Its fibres absorbed some moisture, but maintained their structure and their ability to trap air. Air pockets are what provide insulation, and wool's crimped, irregular fibres created thousands of tiny spaces where air could be held close to the body. Even when damp, these spaces remained partially functional. A wool blanket that had absorbed moisture from a sleeper's perspiration would still provide meaningful warmth through the night. This property made wool blankets one of the most valued possessions on the prairie. Families would prioritize wool blankets over many other goods. They would pay premium prices for quality wool. They would mend and maintain wool blankets with great care, because replacing them was expensive and not always possible. The most prized wool blankets were those made by the Hudson's Bay Company. These were thick, heavy blankets woven from high-quality wool. They featured distinctive markings, small indigo-dyed lines called points woven into one corner. These points indicated the blanket's size. A 4-point blanket was larger than a 3-point blanket. The point system originated as a trade standard, a way to communicate value in regions where multiple languages were spoken and literacy was not universal. Hudson's Bay blankets were expensive. They represented a significant investment for most families, but they were also durable. A well-maintained Hudson's Bay blanket could last for years, serving multiple family members across multiple seasons. The weight of these blankets was substantial. A large one could weigh 8 or 10 pounds, but that weight was part of their effectiveness. Heavy fabric blocked wind better. It stayed in place rather than shifting during sleep. It created a sense of security and enclosure. Not everyone could afford Hudson's Bay quality. Many families made do with less expensive wool blankets, or with blankets woven at home if they had access to wool and a loom. Homemade blankets varied in quality. Some were excellent, carefully crafted from good wool by skilled weavers. Others were rougher, made from whatever wool was available, adequate but not ideal. The colour of wool blankets was usually natural, shades of cream, grey or brown depending on the sheep breed. Some were dyed, but dye was an expense and a luxury. Most prairie families cared more about warmth than appearance. A worn, patched, faded blanket that still held heat was far more valuable than a newer, thinner blanket that looked better. Wool also resisted flame better than many fabrics. This was important around open fires and hot stoves. A spark that landed on wool might smoulder, creating a small burned spot, but it was less likely to ignite into flame than cotton or synthetic materials would be. Given that fire was constant in prairie life, this flame resistance provided an additional margin of safety. The texture of wool was distinctive. It was scratchy against bare skin, which is why wool blankets were usually laid over other layers rather than used directly against the body. The lanolin, the natural oil in sheep's wool, gave the fabric a slight greasiness when new. This lanolin content also contributed to wool's water-resistant properties. Light moisture would bead on the surface of a wool blanket rather than soaking in immediately. Over time, wool blankets developed a character. They softened slightly with use. They conformed to the bodies that slept under them. They absorbed the smells of smoke and prairie grass and human presence. They became familiar, a known quantity in an environment where much was uncertain. Maintaining wool blankets required some care. They needed to be aired out regularly to prevent them from becoming musty. They needed to be shaken to remove dust and debris. They needed to be kept dry when possible, though this was not always feasible. And they needed to be protected from moths, which would eat through wool fabric and create holes that compromised warmth. The weight of blankets varied depending on how many a family could carry or acquire. A single thick wool blanket provided substantial warmth. 2 blankets could be layered, with one laid over the ground sheet and one placed on top of the sleepers. 3 or 4 blankets offered even more insulation, though carrying that many was a luxury most families on the move could not afford. In the coldest weather, pioneers learned to use their wool blankets strategically. A blanket might be folded double to increase thickness over the parts of the body that lost heat fastest, the torso, the feet. Children, who were smaller and lost heat more quickly than adults, might be wrapped entirely in a wool blanket before being placed in the family's communal bed. Wool's value extended beyond blankets. Wool clothing, coats, hats, scarves, socks, provided the same benefits of warmth retention and moisture management. A wool coat worn over several layers of other clothing created an effective barrier against wind and cold. Wool socks, even when they became damp from perspiration, continued to keep feet warmer than cotton socks would. The availability of wool varied by region and by economic circumstance. Families moving from eastern states often brought wool goods with them, recognizing their value for the journey ahead. Those who settled and established homesteads sometimes kept sheep, which provided wool for home use. Sheep were less common on the open prairie than cattle or horses, but in regions where grazing was adequate and predators could be managed, they offered a renewable source of fibre. The economics of wool acquisition shaped family decisions. A quality wool blanket might cost a week's wages for a labourer. For a family with limited cash, this represented a significant portion of their resources. The decision to purchase wool rather than cheaper cotton bedding was not made lightly, but those who made the investment rarely regretted it. The difference in warmth and comfort was immediately apparent. Wool trading patterns developed across the frontier. General stores in towns along wagon routes stocked wool blankets, recognizing them as essential goods that travellers would pay premium prices for. Trading posts did brisk business in wool goods, often accepting barter, tools, food stores, even labour, in exchange for blankets. Some families who arrived with excess wool goods found they could trade blankets for other necessities, using wool as a kind of currency. For homesteading families who progressed to keeping sheep, the annual shearing became an important event. The wool harvest represented both practical value, material for the family's own use, and potential income if surplus wool could be sold or traded. The work of processing raw wool into usable fibre was substantial: washing, carding, spinning, and finally weaving or knitting. But for families with the skills and equipment, producing their own wool goods offered independence from the fluctuating prices and limited availability of store-bought textiles. The comparison with other cultures' solutions to prairie cold revealed wool's advantages. Native American groups who had lived on the plains for generations used buffalo robes as their primary cold-weather bedding, supplemented by furs and hides. Mexican settlers in the southern plains often used heavy woven blankets made from wool, but in different patterns and weights than Anglo-American wool blankets. Each cultural group had developed effective solutions to the same problem, but wool, particularly the heavy wool of Hudson's Bay blankets, became the standard for pioneer families because it combined effectiveness with relative portability. The life cycle of a wool blanket on the frontier was typically long. A blanket purchased for a family's wagon journey might serve for a decade or more if carefully maintained. It would begin its life as primary bedding, used every night. As it aged and began to show wear, it might be demoted to secondary use, a ground sheet cover, a wagon padding, a wrap for fragile items. Eventually, when too worn for practical use, the wool might be cut into patches for repairing other blankets, or shredded and used as stuffing for quilts. Nothing was wasted. For pioneers who could not obtain or afford wool, the alternatives were limited and less effective. Heavy canvas provided some wind protection but little insulation. Cotton quilts, if layered thickly, offered some warmth in dry conditions but failed when moisture was present. Animal hides, when available, were effective but heavy and difficult to maintain. The primacy of wool in prairie sleep cannot be overstated. It was the material that made cold weather sleep possible for the majority of travellers and settlers. It was the fabric that families relied on night after night, through the hardest parts of winter. It was not perfect, no single material was, but it was the best option available, and pioneers treated it accordingly. The weight of security. If wool was the king of fabrics, the buffalo robe was the emperor. It stood above all other bedding in warmth, durability, and effectiveness. A buffalo robe was not simply a blanket made from different material, it was a different order of protection entirely. A buffalo robe was made from the hide of a bison, taken during winter when the animal's coat was at its thickest. The hide was tanned, a process that made the leather soft and pliable while leaving the fur attached. The result was a heavy, substantial piece of material, 15 pounds or more for a full-size robe. The fur side was dense and oily, naturally water-resistant and windproof. The leather side was smooth and durable. The process of obtaining a buffalo robe varied. Some pioneers hunted bison themselves if they encountered herds during their travels. Hunting bison was dangerous and difficult. The animals were large, powerful, and unpredictable. A wounded bison could charge with devastating force. Even a successful hunt required significant work to process the animal: skinning, butchering, preserving meat, and preparing the hide. More commonly, pioneers acquired buffalo robes through trade with Native Americans. Many tribes had long-established traditions of hunting bison and processing hides. They had the skills, tools, and knowledge to produce high-quality robes. For tribes, buffalo robes had both use value and exchange value. They could be traded for goods that were otherwise difficult to obtain: metal tools, fabric, weapons, food staples. The trading process took place at forts, trading posts, or through direct negotiation when wagon trains and tribal groups crossed paths. A buffalo robe was not cheap. It might cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a labourer, or a significant portion of a family's limited cash reserves, but pioneers who could afford one considered it money well spent. The warmth provided by a buffalo robe was exceptional. The thick fur trapped air close to the body. The natural oils in the fur repelled moisture. The weight of the robe created a sealed environment that held heat effectively. A person sleeping under a buffalo robe, even in sub-zero temperatures, could maintain body warmth through the night. Buffalo robes could be used in two ways. Laid on the ground with fur side down, a robe created an insulated floor. The fur provided cushioning and separation from the cold earth. The leather side faced upward, offering a smooth surface for other bedding. This configuration was particularly valuable for sleepers who did not have a proper mattress or tick. The robe alone made sleeping on frozen ground tolerable. Alternatively, a buffalo robe could be used as a top covering laid over blankets with the fur side facing inward. In this configuration, the fur trapped body heat close to the sleeper. The leather side faced outward, where it blocked wind and shed light snow or frost. This created a cocoon-like environment, warm and protected. Some families fortunate enough to own two buffalo robes used one on the ground and one on top, sandwiching themselves and their wool blankets between layers of fur and leather. This was the warmest sleeping arrangement possible on the prairie. It was not comfortable in the sense of softness or ease. Buffalo robes were heavy and somewhat stiff, but it was profoundly warm. The weight of a buffalo robe, which might seem like a disadvantage, was actually part of its effectiveness. The heavy material did not shift or blow away in wind. It stayed where it was placed. It pressed down on the sleeper, creating constant contact that minimized air gaps where heat could escape. This pressure also provided a psychological sense of security, a feeling of being protected and enclosed. Buffalo robes required some maintenance. They needed to be aired out regularly to prevent them from developing odours. They needed to be kept as dry as possible, though the natural water resistance of the fur helped with this. They needed to be protected from insects and rodents, which might damage the leather or fur if given the opportunity. The durability of buffalo robes was remarkable. A well-maintained robe could last for many years, serving a family through multiple winters and multiple stages of settlement. Unlike fabric blankets, which could tear or wear thin, buffalo robes maintained their integrity. The leather was tough. The fur, while it might shed somewhat over time, remained dense and functional. The possession of a buffalo robe was often mentioned in letters and diaries. Pioneers wrote home about acquiring one, about how much it cost, about how much difference it made during cold nights. Robes were valuable enough that they were sometimes listed in wills and estate inventories, passed down from parents to children as significant inheritances. For cowboys and single travellers, a buffalo robe was often the core of their sleeping system. They might not have multiple blankets. They might not have the luxury of a wagon or a shelter. But if they had a buffalo robe, they had the foundation of survival. The robe could be rolled around their body, creating a sleeping bag of sorts. It could be laid on the ground to sleep on or draped over a bedroll for additional top insulation. The trade in buffalo robes was substantial during the peak years of westward expansion. Thousands of robes moved through trading networks each year. Native American hunters supplied many of these robes. But as bison populations declined due to overhunting and deliberate extermination campaigns, robes became scarcer and more expensive. By the 1880s, buffalo robes were increasingly difficult to obtain, and those who had them guarded them carefully. The decline of the bison had direct consequences for prairie sleep. As buffalo robes became unavailable, pioneers had to rely more heavily on wool blankets and other materials. This was manageable for most, but for those living in the coldest regions or facing the harshest winters, the absence of buffalo robes represented a genuine loss of capacity to stay warm. Some attempted to substitute other hides. Bear hides, when available, provided substantial warmth and were even heavier than buffalo robes. Elk hides were occasionally used. Cattle hides, while more common, lacked the dense fur of bison and were less effective as insulation. None of these alternatives matched the combination of warmth, durability, and water resistance that buffalo robes provided. For the cowboys of the late 19th century, buffalo robes remained a symbol of quality and preparedness. An experienced hand with a good robe had credibility. It suggested someone who knew what they were doing, who had invested in the right equipment. It marked the difference between a greenhorn and a veteran of the range. The economics of buffalo robe trade created interesting patterns. In the early years of prairie settlement, when bison were still abundant, robes were relatively affordable. A family with modest means could acquire one with a few days' wages, but as the herds declined, prices rose dramatically. By the 1870s, A quality buffalo robe might cost a month's wages or more. This made robes increasingly a luxury item rather than a standard piece of equipment. The pricing variations also reflected quality differences. A robe from a prime winter-killed bull bison, properly tanned with thick fur, commanded premium prices. Robes from cows or younger animals were less expensive. Spring-killed robes, when the animals were beginning to shed their winter coats, were cheaper still but also less effective for cold weather use. Experienced buyers learned to assess robe quality, checking fur density, leather suppleness, and overall size. The inheritance of buffalo robes reflected their value. Wills and estate inventories from the frontier period frequently list buffalo robes as specific bequests. A father might leave his buffalo robe to a son who is preparing for his own homesteading journey. A mother might designate her robe for a daughter setting up a new household. These weren't casual gifts, they represented significant wealth transfer. Regional availability differences also shaped buffalo robe use. In areas where the Oregon Trail passed through prime bison range, robes were more readily available through trade. In regions where bison had never been numerous, or where they had been hunted out early, robes were rare and expensive. This created a kind of gradient of preparedness. Travelers in bison country could acquire robes easily, while those in regions without bison had to pay premium prices to traders who had transported robes from elsewhere. The stories of desperate attempts to substitute buffalo robes after the herds declined reveal just how valued they were. Some families tried using multiple cattle hides stitched together, but these lacked the insulating fur. Others experimented with layering sheepskins, which provided some warmth, but required many skins to equal one buffalo robe. A few tried using heavy canvas stuffed with wool or straw, creating crude sleeping bags. These substitutes worked to varying degrees, but none matched the simple effectiveness of a buffalo robe. The buffalo robe represented, in physical form, the relationship between the prairie environment and human adaptation. The bison had evolved over millennia to survive the plains in winter. Their thick coats were the result of that evolutionary process. When humans repurposed those coats for their own survival, they were borrowing the bison's solution to cold. It was a direct transfer of biological adaptation, from animal to human use. And when the bison were gone, that adaptation was lost, forcing humans to develop less effective alternatives from materials that had not been shaped by the same environmental pressures. The ground as enemy. The cold of the air was obvious and immediate. It could be felt on the skin, though seen in the formation of ice, measured by the body's shivering response. But the cold of the ground was different. It was subtle, persistent, and harder to defend against. The earth in winter acted as a heat sink, pulling warmth from any body in contact with it. Pioneers understood this phenomenon well, even if they lacked scientific terminologies to explain it. They called it ground suck or ground cold. They knew from experience that sleeping directly on frozen earth was dangerous. The ground did not just fail to provide warmth, it actively drained warmth away. The earth has mass and thermal inertia. When winter temperatures drop and stay low for weeks, the ground freezes to a depth of several feet. This frozen ground is a massive reservoir of cold. It does not warm quickly, even when the sun shines. It remains cold day and night, always ready to absorb heat from anything warmer than itself. A human body generates heat continuously through metabolism. When lying on cold ground, that heat conducts directly through clothing and into the earth. The ground absorbs the heat without warming perceptibly, because its mass is so much greater than the body's heat output. The body must work harder to maintain temperature, burning more energy and struggling to stay warm, even if the air temperature is moderate. The sensation of ground cold was distinctive. It was not the sharp, immediate cold of wind. It was a slow, penetrating cold that started at the points of contact, hip, shoulder, side of the leg, and gradually spread. A person lying on cold ground would feel chill creeping into their body from below, even when wrapped in blankets that kept the air cold at bay. This cold was particularly noticeable during the transition to sleep. When first lying down, the body's warmth and the insulation of clothing provided some buffer. But over the course of an hour, as the body remained motionless and heat conducted steadily into the ground, the cold would become more apparent. The hip pressed against earth would begin to ache. The shoulder would grow numb. The side of the body would feel chilled while the top remained relatively warm. The physical effects of ground cold extended beyond immediate discomfort. Muscles tensed in response to cold, particularly in the areas of direct contact. This tension prevented true relaxation and disrupted sleep. A person might drift into light sleep, but wake repeatedly as cold penetrated, or as tense muscles cramped. The result was a night of fragmented, unsatisfying rest. Morning often revealed the full impact. Those who had slept on inadequately insulated ground woke with deep aches in hips and shoulders. The pain was not surface level. It was a bone-deep soreness that lasted hours into the day. Movement was stiff. Tasks that required bending or reaching were uncomfortable. The body had spent the night fighting cold and had exhausted itself in the process. Over multiple nights, the effects accumulated. Chronic undersleep combined with constant muscular tension led to fatigue that rest could not fully address. Pioneers who spent weeks sleeping on poorly insulated ground showed the effects. They moved more slowly, had less energy for work, and were more susceptible to illness. Ground cold was not just uncomfortable, it was debilitating over time. The ground sheet was the single most important piece of bedding for defense against ground cold. It served as a barrier, a layer specifically designed to reduce heat conduction between body and ground. The most basic ground sheet was a piece of canvas, heavy, tightly woven fabric that provided some insulation and blocked dampness. Canvas was not a perfect insulator, but it was better than nothing. It created a layer of slightly trapped air between ground and sleeper. It kept moisture from seeping upward. It protected other bedding from dirt and abrasion. A canvas ground sheet was standard equipment for most wagon travellers, often doubling as a wagon cover or a makeshift shelter during the day. The thickness of canvas mattered significantly. Light canvas, like that used for summer tents, provided minimal protection from ground cold. Heavy canvas, multiple layers thick and tightly woven, performed much better. The heaviest grades of canvas used for ground sheets were nearly as thick as leather, weighing several ounces per square foot. This weight made them cumbersome to handle, but effective at blocking cold. Canvas quality varied by manufacturer and by age. New canvas was stiff and somewhat water-resistant due to the tightness of its weave. Used canvas, softened by exposure and repeated folding, was more comfortable but less effective at blocking moisture. Torn or worn canvas lost much of its protective value, with thin spots becoming pathways for cold and damp. For those who could afford it, rubberized fabric offered better protection. This was canvas that had been treated with rubber to make it waterproof. Gutta percha cloth was flexible, durable, and highly water-resistant. It blocked moisture completely, valuable when ground was damp from rain or snow, when overnight frost formed, or when sleeper perspiration accumulated. The rubber treatment gave the fabric a distinctive character. It had a slight sheen and a smooth, almost slippery texture. The smell was noticeable, a chemical, slightly sweet odour that some found unpleasant, but most simply accepted. The rubber coating made the fabric somewhat stiffer than untreated canvas, especially in cold weather, but it remained flexible enough for practical use. The cost of rubberized fabric was significant, which limited its availability. Families with limited resources used canvas or, in some cases, nothing at all. Sleeping without a ground sheet was possible but unpleasant. The body's heat was wasted warming the earth. Cold seeped through clothing. Dampness from the ground made everything feel colder than it actually was. The ground's composition affected how cold it felt. Sandy soil drained well and warmed slightly faster than clay during the day. Clay soil retained moisture and felt colder. Rocky ground was uncomfortable due to uneven surface, but sometimes drained better than either sand or clay. Each soil type presented its own challenges. Sandy areas were generally preferred for sleeping when pioneers had a choice. The sand conformed slightly to the body's shape, reducing pressure points. It drained quickly after rain, meaning it was less likely to be damp, and it had slightly better insulating properties than clay or rock. Wagon trains would sometimes travel an extra distance to reach sandy ground for camping. Clay-heavy soil was less desirable. It had stayed damp longer after rain. It was hard and unyielding, creating uncomfortable pressure points, and it felt colder. The moisture it retained enhanced heat conduction, pulling warmth from the body more effectively than dry soil. Clay ground required extra attention to ground sheet placement and bedding arrangement. Rocky ground presented different problems. The rocks themselves were excellent conductors of cold. A rock pressed against a sleeper's body would draw heat away rapidly. Even small rocks, if positioned under hip or shoulder, could create enough discomfort to prevent sleep. Clearing rocks from the sleeping area was essential but not always possible. In some regions, the ground was so rocky that complete clearing was impractical. The depth of ground freezing varied by season and location. Early winter, when only the surface had frozen, was less challenging. Late winter, after weeks of sustained cold, might see ground frozen to depths of 3 feet or more. This deeply frozen ground was a massive heat sink, essentially impossible to warm through any practical means. Ground temperature also varied by time of day, though the variation was muted compared to air temperature. Ground that received sun during the day would be slightly warmer at its surface during evening, but this warmth penetrated only an inch or two deep. The mass of cold earth beneath overwhelmed the surface warming. By midnight, even that minimal surface warmth had dissipated. Snow presented complex considerations for ground sleeping. Fresh snow was paradoxically a good insulator. The air trapped between snow crystals resisted heat transfer. A thick layer of fresh, dry snow could actually provide some insulation between sleeper and frozen ground beneath. However, body heat could melt the snow's surface, creating a layer of ice that then conducted heat away very effectively. Some experienced winter travelers learned to manage snow sleeping. They would deliberately choose a sleeping location with deep, undisturbed snow. The ground sheet would be laid on top of the snow rather than on bare ground. The snow beneath acted as an insulating layer, and careful positioning could prevent enough melting to create problems. This technique was not common and required practice, but it was viable in the right conditions. More typical was the practice of clearing snow away entirely, exposing the frozen ground beneath. This avoided the melting problem, but meant sleeping directly on the coldest available surface. It was a trade-off, no ice formation but maximum ground cold. Most pioneers chose this approach because it was more predictable and easier to manage. On particularly cold nights, some pioneers used a double-layer system. They would lay one ground sheet, then add a layer of loose material, prairie hay, spare clothing, saddle blankets, and then lay a second ground sheet on top of that. This sandwich created an insulated floor with 2 moisture barriers and a layer of material that trapped additional air. It was heavier and more work to set up, but it provided measurably more comfort. For cowboys sleeping on the open range, the bedroll's bottom layer served as the ground sheet. This was typically a large piece of canvas or waterproof tarp substantial enough to wrap around the entire sleeping system. The cowboy would lay out this tarp, place his blankets and quilts on the lower half, then fold the upper half over the top. The tarp's bottom portion thus became the ground sheet, while the folded portion became the top cover. For homesteaders who had moved beyond sleeping on the ground and into dugouts or sod houses, the ground cold problem persisted in modified form. The floor of a dugout was still earth. It was somewhat warmer than the surface ground outside, thanks to geothermal effects, but it was still cold. A floor covering, boards if available, canvas if not, helped reduce direct contact with earth. The geothermal warmth of a dugout floor was real but modest. At depths of several feet, earth maintained a relatively stable temperature, perhaps 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface conditions. This was warmer than the outside air in winter, but it was still well below comfortable sleeping temperature. The floor of a dugout, while not frozen, still pulled heat from bodies in contact with it. Canvas laid on a dugout floor provided the same benefits it provided outdoors, moisture barrier, and some insulation. But pioneers with dugouts often sought to improve beyond canvas. Woven grass mats, when available, provided additional cushioning and insulation. Animal hides could be laid on the floor. Anything that created separation between sleeper and earth was valuable. The eventual luxury for a homesteader was a wooden floor. Boards created an air gap between earth and living space. This gap, even if it was only a few inches, dramatically reduced ground cold. A wooden floor also provided a surface that could be swept clean, which made maintaining hygiene easier. But lumber was expensive and often unavailable on the treeless prairie, so wooden floors were an aspiration rather than an immediate reality for most settlers. Pioneers who slept without adequate ground protection often described waking with aching backs and hips. This was not just discomfort, it was a sign that the body had been working hard all night to maintain warmth in areas pressed against cold ground. Muscles had tensed, blood flow had increased to those areas, energy reserves had been depleted. The result was fatigue, soreness, and a reduced capacity to work effectively the next day. The physical toll of poor ground insulation was cumulative. One cold night left a person stiff and sore but functional. Multiple nights in succession left them increasingly fatigued. Weeks of inadequate sleep on cold ground could lead to illness. The body's immune function declined when constantly stressed by cold. Pioneers understood this connection even without scientific explanation. They knew that staying warm at night was necessary for staying healthy overall. Children were particularly vulnerable to ground cold because of their smaller body mass and higher surface area to volume ratio. A child's body generated less total heat than an adult's, and lost heat more quickly relative to body size. This meant children needed more careful protection from ground cold than adults did. Parents learned to place children in the center of the family sleeping area, surrounded by adults whose larger bodies could help maintain warmth. The ground sheet and the bottom blankets would be layered most thickly where children slept. Extra clothing or cloth might be placed beneath a child's sleeping position to create additional insulation. These protective measures were not luxury, they were necessity for child survival. The ground cold lesson was one that every pioneer learned quickly, often painfully. The first night sleeping on the prairie, even with adequate top covering, could be miserable if ground insulation was neglected. But the lesson once learned was never forgotten. The ground sheet became as important as any blanket, as essential as any other piece of equipment. It was the foundation upon which all other sleeping arrangements were built. Experienced travellers could often identify newcomers by how they prepared their sleeping area. A greenhorn might focus on blankets and top covering, neglecting the ground sheet. A veteran would inspect the ground carefully, select the best available spot, lay the ground sheet with attention to edges and securing, and only then arrange bedding on top. This difference in approach revealed itself in the quality of sleep obtained and in the condition of the sleeper come morning. The cowboy's cocoon. The cowboy occupied a particular place in prairie sleep culture. He was by necessity the most minimalist and self-reliant sleeper. On a cattle drive, especially during the late season trailing when weather was coldest, the cowboy had no wagon to shelter beneath, no family members to share warmth with, no permanent structure to retreat into. His entire home was his bedroll. The bedroll, called a sugan in cowboy parlance, was not casually assembled. It was a carefully constructed system, the result of hard-won experience. Every component had a purpose. Every layer was arranged in a specific order. The difference between a well-made bedroll and a poorly made one could determine whether a man slept or merely endured the night. The foundation of the bedroll was the tarp. This was a large piece of canvas, typically 7 to 8 feet long and 5 to 6 feet wide when laid out. Some tarps were treated with oil to make them water resistant. This treatment gave the canvas a distinctive smell and a slightly stiff texture. The oil-treated canvas, often called oil skin, shed rain and snow more effectively than untreated material. The oil treatment was applied by hand, usually by the cowboy himself or by whoever had made the tarp. Linseed oil was most common, rubbed into the canvas and allowed to soak in and dry. The process had to be repeated periodically to maintain water resistance. Fresh oil treatment left the canvas dark and pungent. Aged treatment looked worn but remained functional. The oil also made the canvas more durable, protecting the fibres from rot and wear. The tarp served multiple functions. When the bedroll was set up for sleeping, the tarp was laid flat on the ground. The cowboy's blankets, quilts, and any other bedding were placed on the lower half of the tarp. The upper half was then folded over the top, creating an envelope. This design meant the tarp functioned both as ground sheet and as weather protection. The size of the tarp was critical. Too small and it would not wrap completely around the sleeper, leaving gaps for wind and cold. Too large and it became cumbersome to carry and difficult to manage when setting up. The standard dimensions, 7 to 8 feet by 5 to 6 feet, represented generations of experience finding the right balance. Cowboys would sometimes customize their tarps. Extra grommets might be added along the edges, allowing the tarp to be staked down in high wind. Patches would be sewn over tiers or worn spots. Some cowboys added corner pockets or loops where small items could be secured. A tarp became personalized over time, marked by repairs and modifications that reflected its owner's preferences and experiences. Inside the tarp envelope were the sugans, the blankets and quilts that provided warmth. A cowboy's wealth was often measured not in money, but in the quality of these blankets. A new hand, just starting out, might have only 2 thin blankets. An experienced cowboy might have 4 or 5 good wool blankets and a heavy quilt. The progression from new cowboy to veteran could be traced through bedroll quality. A young man starting his first cattle drive might have borrowed or cheaply purchased blankets, thin and worn. After a season's wages, he might upgrade to 1 good wool blanket. After several seasons, if he was careful with his money and not unlucky with injury or unemployment, he could accumulate a proper bedroll, thick blankets, a quilt, perhaps even a buffalo robe. These were not decorative items. They were worn, patched, faded by sun and washed by rain, but they were maintained carefully. A torn blanket was mended as soon as the tear was discovered. A lost button on a blanket's edge was replaced. The cowboy understood that his blankets were not luxuries, they were survival equipment. The mending of blankets was done during slow times, on rest days, during evening hours when there was still light to see by, during the long hours of riding when a needle and thread could be carried in a pocket. The stitches might not be neat, but they were functional. A patch might be cut from an old shirt or a piece of canvas. What mattered was keeping the blanket intact and warm. The arrangement of blankets within the bedroll followed a logic. The heaviest blanket was usually placed on the bottom, directly on the top's lower half to provide maximum insulation from ground cold. Lighter blankets were layered onto top. The final layer, if the cowboy had a quilt, was often a handmade quilt, perhaps made by a mother or sister, carried across thousands of miles, representing one of the few personal connections to home. These quilts had stories. They might be made from scraps of family clothing, each piece of fabric carrying memories. A patch might come from a father's work shirt, another from a sister's dress, another from a baby blanket long outgrown. The quilts were heavy with sentiment as well as with physical weight. They were reminders of home on nights when home seemed impossibly distant. The quilt was placed on top, closest to the body, because quilts had a quality that blankets did not. They were less likely to shift during sleep. The quilting stitches held the fabric and filling in place. The quilt stayed where it was laid, maintaining consistent coverage. This was valuable during a night when a sleeper might move frequently, trying to find comfort on hard ground. When it was time to sleep, the cowboy would remove only his hat and his boots. Everything else stayed on. He slept in his shirt, his vest, his pants, sometimes even his chaps if the night was particularly cold. Removing clothing meant losing the warmth those clothes had absorbed during the day. It meant exposing skin to cold air. It meant the body would have to work to re-warm those clothes in the morning. This practice of sleeping fully clothed had additional benefits. It meant a cowboy could respond immediately to any emergency, a stampede, a predator, a storm. There was no need to dress before acting. The clothing also provided an extra layer of insulation, working with the blankets to trap heat, and it protected the blankets themselves from direct contact with the body's oils and perspiration, keeping them cleaner longer. The specific arrangement of clothing during sleep developed through experience. The vest remained buttoned to prevent it from opening and creating gaps where cold could enter. The collar of the shirt might be turned up to protect the neck. The pants were sometimes tucked into the socks to seal the gap at the ankles. These small adjustments made meaningful differences in warmth. The boots were placed carefully just outside the tarp near the cowboy's head, positioned heel to heel with toes pointing outward. They had to be close enough to reach without leaving the bedroll, but not so close that they might be kicked during sleep. Boots that froze solid overnight were difficult to put on in the morning. Leather became stiff and unresponsive. Laces froze. Getting frozen boots onto cold feet was painful and time-consuming. The hat was placed over the face. This served multiple purposes. It blocked light if there was a moon, helping the eyes adjust to darkness and prepare for sleep. It created a small pocket of warmer air around the mouth and nose, making breathing more comfortable in very cold air. It provided a sense of enclosure and privacy, important in the communal sleeping arrangements of a cattle drive. And it kept frost from forming on the face during the coldest hours before dawn. The hat-over-face technique had to be learned. New cowboys sometimes found it claustrophobic or uncomfortable, but experienced hands swore by it. The difference in comfort was real enough that most cowboys adopted the practice within their first season. The slight restriction of breathing was more than compensated by the warmth and protection provided. The tarp's upper half was then pulled over the body, creating a complete envelope. The cowboy would tuck the edges of the tarp around himself, using his body weight to hold them in place. This prevented wind from entering. It created a sealed environment where body heat could accumulate rather than disperse. The tightness of this seal was critical on windy nights when any gap would allow cold air to penetrate. The process of entering the bedroll and sealing it properly required some practice. A cowboy learned to slide into the opening, then use controlled movements to position himself and arrange the layers without disturbing the careful setup. Excessive thrashing would disarrange blankets and create gaps. Smooth, deliberate movements kept everything in place. On very cold nights, the cowboy might also pull his saddle close and use it as a windbreak on the side facing the prevailing wind. The saddle was always nearby anyway. Cowboys slept with their saddles because saddles were valuable, and theft was a real concern. But the saddle's bulk also provided some wind protection, and the leather absorbed some cold that would otherwise reach the sleeper. The saddle would be positioned strategically, close enough to disrupt airflow, but not so close that it would be in the way if the cowboy needed to exit the bedroll quickly. The location of the bedroll was chosen with care. The leeward side of the chuck wagon was preferred, the large, heavy supply wagon that accompanied cattle drives. The wagon blocked wind and provided some psychological comfort. It was a structure, a reference point in the vast openness. Sleeping near the chuck wagon also meant being close to the cook, who was typically the first person awake and the one who would restart the fire in the morning. If no wagon was available, the cowboy looked for any natural feature that might provide wind protection. A low rise in the ground could block wind from one direction. A cluster of brush, even if small, was better than nothing. Even a line of sleeping cattle provided some protection. Anything that disrupted wind flow was valuable. The choice of sleeping location also had to account for drainage. Low spots might seem sheltered from wind, but they could collect cold air or water if it rained. Slight elevation was preferable when available. Once the location was chosen, the cowboy would sometimes scrape a small depression in the ground with his boot heel, a hip hole, a concavity just large enough to accommodate the hip and shoulder of a person sleeping on their side. It made side sleeping more comfortable by reducing pressure points. The depression would be positioned exactly where the hip would rest, usually slightly off-center from the bedroll's midline. The depth was just an inch or two, enough to reduce pressure, but not enough to create an uncomfortable angle. The bedroll was compact when rolled for travel. The blankets and the quilts were stacked in order, then the entire stack was rolled tightly lengthwise. The rolled bedding was then wrapped in the tarp and tied with rope or leather straps. The result was a cylinder about 3 feet long and 8 to 10 inches in diameter. This rolled bedroll was tied behind the cowboy's saddle during the day, where it travelled with him from camp to camp. The rolling technique mattered. Too loose and the bedroll would be bulky and might come undone during travel. Too tight and it would be difficult to unroll in the evening, especially if hands were cold or stiff. The right tightness came from practice. Experienced cowboys could roll their bedrolls quickly and efficiently, producing a neat-sewn cylinder that would stay secure through a day's riding. The compactness was necessary because space was limited. A cowboy on a cattle drive had only what he could carry on his horse. There was no wagon for personal belongings. Everything had to fit. Bedroll, rope, saddle, little bags with minimal clothing and personal items, perhaps a canteen and a weapon. The bedroll was the largest single item he carried, but it could not be left behind. This limitation meant cowboys became expert at minimalism, discarding anything that didn't justify its weight. Sleep for a cowboy on night guard was fragmented. The work was organised in shifts, typically 2 hours per man. A herd of cattle required constant watching at night. They were nervous creatures, prone to stampeding if startled. A night guard rode slowly around the perimeter of the herd, keeping the cattle calm through his presence. This meant a cowboy might sleep from 8 in the evening until 10, when he would be woken for his guard shift. He would ride for 2 hours, circling the herd in darkness, watching and listening. He would return to his bedroll at midnight. He would then try to sleep again, but the bedroll had cooled significantly in his absence. The challenge was to reclaim that warmth quickly enough to get more meaningful rest before being woken again at 4 in the morning to help with the day's work. The return to a cooled bedroll was one of the hardest parts of night guard. The first entry into the bedroll created warmth through body heat and insulation, but after 2 hours in the cold night air, that warmth had dissipated. Re-entering meant starting the warming process over. The body would shiver, burning energy to generate heat. It might take 20 minutes or more to warm the bedroll to a comfortable level, and by then, only an hour or so of sleep remained before the next wake-up. This interrupted sleep pattern was exhausting. The body never fully entered deep restorative sleep. The constant alertness required during guard shifts, watching for predators, listening for the unusual sounds from the cattle, staying awake in the saddle, to depleted mental and physical reserves. The cold made everything harder. The technique of staying awake during guard shifts varied. Some cowboys sang or hummed, both to keep themselves alert and to calm the cattle. The songs were usually slow and monotonous, more like chanting than singing. The content didn't matter. What mattered was the steady, predictable sound that told the cattle everything was normal and safe. Other cowboys talked to themselves, conducted internal conversations, recited poetry or Bible verses they had memorized, or simply counted things. The number of circuits around the herd, the stars visible in a particular section of sky, the breaths of their horse. Anything to keep the mind active and prevent the dangerous drift towards sleep while in the saddle. The cattle themselves provided some of the alertness. A cowboy learned to listen to the herd's sounds. Contented cattle were mostly quiet with occasional low sounds of breathing or movement. Changes in those sounds, increased restlessness, a sudden quiet, unusual vocalizations, required immediate attention. This constant monitoring kept the mind engaged. On the coldest nights, cowboys sometimes slept in pairs, sharing a combined bedroll. This was not common. Men valued their personal space and their individual bedrolls, but when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, practicality overrode preference. 2 men in one bedroll could share body heat, making the system significantly warmer. The arrangement required trust and comfort with proximity, but it could mean the difference between getting some rest and spending the night in shivering misery. The logistics of paired sleeping required coordination. The two would position themselves back-to-back or side-by-side, depending on space and preference. Both sets of blankets would be combined, creating a thicker layer of insulation. The shared body heat would warm the bedroll faster and maintain warmth more effectively than either man could alone. But coordination was needed for turning during the night. Both men would need to shift together to avoid creating gaps in the coverage. The cowboy's relationship with his bedroll was personal. It was the only piece of home he carried. It smelled of smoke and horse and prairie grass. It was familiar in a life of constant movement. Setting it up each evening was a ritual, a series of known steps that marked the transition from day to night. Rolling it up each morning was the reverse ritual, preparing for the next phase of travel. The bedroll was also a marker of identity and experience. An old hand's bedroll showed signs of use and care. Patches on the tarp, worn but clean blankets, the entire system well organised and efficiently packed. A new cowboy's bedroll might be newer but poorly designed, with inadequate layers or improper arrangement. The veterans could assess experience level by bedroll quality before any words were spoken. Stories and songs from the cowboy era often mentioned the bedroll. It appeared in ballads about trail life, in humorous anecdotes about cold nights, in serious accounts of men who died in their bedrolls during unexpected blizzards. The bedroll was not romantic. It was practical, essential, and sometimes insufficient. But it was what the cowboy had, and so he made it work. The inadequacy of bedrolls in extreme weather was acknowledged but accepted. Cowboys understood that their sleeping arrangements were minimal. On truly brutal nights, when temperatures dropped well below zero, and wind howled without cease, the bedroll might provide just enough warmth to survive, but not enough to sleep comfortably. Those nights were endured rather than rested through, and the next day's work suffered as a result. But most nights were not extreme. Most nights were simply cold, and the bedroll was adequate for that level of cold. The cowboy would sleep fitfully, wake a few times to adjust position or pull the tarp tighter, and emerge at dawn stiff but functional. It was not the sleep of comfort, but it was enough to continue. The art of the ember. Fire provided warmth, but fire was temporary. Flames consumed fuel, and fuel was scarce. The challenge was not simply to build a fire, but to extend its warmth beyond the time when flames were actively burning. This required techniques of heat storage and preservation, ways to capture warmth and hold it through the long cold night. The transition from active fire to preserved heat began in the evening, well before anyone was ready to sleep. The fire that cooked the evening meal was built large and maintained for hours. This was not wasteful. The extended burn had a purpose beyond cooking. It was heating the ground. Earth is a poor conductor of heat in the short term, but over time heat can penetrate deep into soil. A fire maintained in one location for 3 or 4 hours would transfer significant warmth into the ground beneath and around it. The surface would become hot enough to be uncomfortable to touch. The subsurface, down to a depth of several inches, would warm above the ambient temperature. When the meal was finished and the fire had burned for sufficient time, the next step was counterintuitive. The fire was moved. Using a shovel or a flat piece of wood, the entire fire, coals, ash, embers, and any remaining unburned fuel, was scraped aside to a new location a few feet away. This left behind a patch of heated earth. The ground sheet and bedding were then laid on this warm spot. The earth acted as a natural heating pad. The warmth radiated upward through the night, gradually cooling but remaining noticeably warm for many hours. This technique, sometimes called firebed sleeping, was particularly effective in cold weather. The heat from below combined with the insulation from blankets above to create a relatively comfortable sleeping environment. The technique required some skill and timing. If the fire was moved too soon, the ground would not be adequately heated. If the fire was moved too late, it might be time to sleep before the ground could be cleared of ash and embers, enough to safely place bedding. Experienced pioneers developed a sense for the right moment, when the fire had burned down to a deep bed of coals and the ground beneath had absorbed enough heat. The scraped-aside fire was not wasted. It was moved to a location where it could continue to provide benefit. Sometimes it was moved to a fire pit that would be used the next morning, giving that area a head start on warming. Sometimes it was placed near where livestock were tethered, offering them some warmth through the night. The fire continued to exist, but its purpose had shifted from cooking to environmental heating. Another technique for extending fire's warmth involved heating stones. Smooth river rocks were preferred because they were less likely to crack or explode when heated. Rough, porous rocks could trap moisture, and when that moisture turned to steam inside a hot rock, the pressure could cause the rock to fracture suddenly, sometimes with enough force to send fragments flying. A suitable stone was placed in the fire in early evening, positioned in the hottest part of the coal bed. It was left there for an hour or more, absorbing heat. The stone would become hot throughout its mass. Unlike wood or other materials that burn, stone does not consume, it only stores. A heated stone could hold warmth for many hours. Just before bedtime, the stone was removed from the fire. This was done carefully, using sticks or a shovel to avoid direct contact. The stone was brushed free of ash and examined to ensure it was not cracked. It was then wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, usually wool, because wool's heat resistance made it safer for this purpose. The wrapping had to be thick enough to prevent the stone from scorching the blankets it would be placed near. The wrapped stone was positioned at the foot of the bed. This location was strategic. Feet lose heat quickly, and cold feet can make the entire body feel cold. A warm stone at the foot of the bed kept toes warm and improved overall comfort. The stone's heat would radiate through the wrappings for much of the night. By morning it would be cool, but during the coldest hours, midnight to 4, it provided valuable warmth. The size of the stone mattered. A small stone heated quickly but cooled quickly. A large stone took longer to heat but held warmth longer. The ideal was a smooth stone about the size of a loaf of bread, large enough to store significant heat but small enough to be manageable and safe within the bedding. Some families used multiple stones if they had the appropriate rocks and the time to heat them. 2 stones could be placed at the feet of 2 sleeping adults. A smaller stone might be placed near children. The process was labour-intensive, finding suitable stones, heating them adequately, wrapping them safely, but the comfort provided made it worthwhile on the coldest nights. The evening fire also had to be managed to provide coals for morning. This was done through banking, the process of preserving live coals overnight. After the fire had burned down and the flames had died, a layer of ash was carefully heaped over the remaining coals. This required judgment. Too much ash would smother the coals completely, extinguishing them. Too little ash would allow too much air to reach the coals, causing them to burn away entirely before morning. The right amount of ash created a balance. It reduced oxygen flow enough to slow combustion dramatically without stopping it entirely. The coals beneath the ash would continue to smoulder at a very slow rate. They would remain hot, glowing red if uncovered, but they would consume only a tiny fraction of their mass overnight. This technique meant that morning fire starting became much simpler. The first person awake, usually at dawn or before, would approach the ash pile and use a stick to carefully dig into it. A few inches below the surface, they would find the preserved coals still alive and hot. Adding a handful of dry grass or other fine tinder directly onto these coals, then blowing gently to introduce oxygen, would cause the tinder to ignite within moments. Small twigs could then be added, followed by larger fuel. The fire would return to life without the need for flint and steel or other fire-starting tools. Starting a fire from scratch in freezing conditions was difficult. Hands went numb quickly. Tinder had to be dry, which was not always easy to ensure. Striking sparks with flint and steel took time and effort. But with banked coals preserved from the previous evening, fire could be rekindled in under a minute. The psychological value of banked coals was significant. Waking in the cold darkness before dawn was difficult, but knowing that fire, warmth, light, the ability to cook breakfast, was only moments away made the transition from sleep to wakefulness more manageable. The banked coals were a promise kept, a link from evening security to morning possibility. The practice of fire banking was taught from parent to child. It was one of the essential skills that children learned as they grew. A child old enough to be trusted near the fire would be shown how to add ash, how to judge the correct amount, how to test the banking by observing the coal's behaviour. Mastery of this skill was a marker of competence, a sign that a young person was learning the practical knowledge necessary for prairie life. Some pioneers became expert at fire management, developing a reputation within their wagon train or community for their ability to keep fires going through any conditions. These individuals might be asked to bank the fire when weather was particularly challenging or when circumstances meant that fire could not be allowed to fail. Their knowledge was valued and respected. The banking technique also had applications beyond overnight preservation. Fires might be banked during the day if a family or group needed to travel for several hours but wanted to maintain fire continuity. The fire would be heavily banked in the morning, then the travellers would move to their next location. Upon arrival, the banked coals would be transported in a metal container, then uncovered and used to start the fire at the new camp. This allowed fire to be physically moved across distances without extinguishing it. The stone wrapped in wool. The practice of heating stones for warmth was ancient, far older than the prairie frontier. Peoples across centuries and continents had discovered the same principle. Stone stores heat and releases it slowly. What made the technique particularly valuable on the prairie was the scarcity of alternatives. Without abundant fuel to keep fires burning all night, and without the option of heated rooms or brick fireplaces, the heated stone became a portable source of warmth. The selection of stones required some knowledge. Not all rocks were suitable. Sedimentary rocks like sandstone or limestone were generally safe. Igneous rocks like granite or basalt were also reliable. The key characteristic was density and low porosity. Dense rocks absorbed heat thoroughly and evenly. Low porosity meant there were few spaces within the rock where moisture could be trapped. River rocks were preferred because flowing water naturally selected for dense, non-porous stone. Rocks that were too soft or porous would have broken down in the river's current. Those that remained were, by default, more suitable for heating. The smoothness of river rocks was an additional benefit. Smooth stones had fewer sharp edges that might tear fabric wrappings or cause injury if accidentally kicked during the night. Rocks found on the open prairie were less predictable. They might be fine-grained and safe, or they might be porous and dangerous. Experienced prairie dwellers learned to identify good heating stones by appearance and by testing. A test involved heating a small sample of a new stone type to see if it cracked. If it survived heating once, it would likely be safe for repeated use. The danger of using improper rocks was real. When a porous rock containing trapped moisture was heated, the water inside turned to steam. Steam occupies much more volume than liquid water. If the steam could not escape, pressure built up inside the rock. When that pressure exceeded the rock's structural strength, the rock exploded. Fragments could be thrown several feet, potentially causing injury to anyone nearby. Such explosions were uncommon but memorable. Pioneers learned to be cautious about stone selection and to never place unknown rocks directly in the hottest part of a fire. New stones were tested at the fire's edge, where temperatures were lower, to see if they showed signs of cracking or steam release. Once a suitable stone was identified, it could be used repeatedly. The same stones would be kept near the fire pit, ready for heating on cold nights. They became familiar objects, pieces of the nightly routine. Children might be tasked with fetching the bedstones in the evening, placing them in the fire while adults prepared other aspects of the sleeping area. The development of stone selection expertise was gradual. A family new to the prairie might lose several stones to cracking before learning which types were safe, but experienced families could assess a stone's suitability quickly. They looked for certain visual cues: smooth texture indicating water weathering, uniform colouring suggesting consistent density, absence of visible pores or cracks. This knowledge was shared, passed from family to family within wagon trains or between neighbouring homesteaders. The variations in technique among different families reflected personal preferences and available resources. Some families preferred using multiple small stones rather than one large stone. The advantage was flexibility. Small stones could be distributed to different family members, with each person having their own source of warmth. The disadvantage was that small stones cooled faster and required more wrapping materials. Other families dedicated themselves to finding one perfect large stone that would serve for years. These stones became treasured possessions, given names, carefully transported when the family moved. A stone that had served well through multiple winters earned a kind of respect. It was proof that the family had learned to manage prairie cold. The heating process was passive. Once placed in the fire's coal bed, the stone simply sat. There was no stirring required, no adjustment. The stone absorbed heat gradually, its interior temperature rising over the course of an hour or more. A larger stone took longer to heat thoroughly, but it would also retain heat longer. The greater mass meant more total stored energy. Timing the stone's removal from the fire was part of the evening routine. It could not be removed too early, before it had fully heated, nor could it be left in too long, because once the fire was banked for the night, retrieving the stone from beneath the ash would be difficult. The stone had to be extracted during that window when the fire had burned down to coals but was still accessible. This timing became intuitive with practice. An experienced fire tender could judge by the colour of the coals the time elapsed since the stone was placed, and even the sound of the fire whether the stone was ready. The coordination between stone heating and other evening tasks, bedding preparation, meal cleanup, animal checking, required careful scheduling. Everything had to happen in the right order for the night to proceed smoothly. Removal required tools because the stone was far too hot to touch. A long stick could be used to roll the stone out of the coal bed. A shovel worked well if available. Some pioneers fashioned simple tongs from green wood, using the natural flexibility of fresh-cut branches to create a gripping tool. The method mattered less than the result. The stone had to be moved from fire to a clear area where it could be wrapped. Once out of the fire, the stone was covered with ash and embers. These had to be brushed off, but not in a way that would cause the stone to cool too rapidly. A few sweeps with a stick or a piece of bark were usually sufficient. The goal was to remove loose debris that might burn through the cloth wrapping, not to clean the stone perfectly. The wrapping material was critical. It had to be thick enough to prevent burns, but not so thick that it completely blocked heat transfer. Wool was ideal because of its heat resistance and insulating properties. Multiple layers of wool cloth, pieces of old blankets, worn clothing, dedicated wrapping cloths, were wound around the stone. The cloth was wrapped loosely enough to allow some air circulation, which prevented scorching, but tightly enough that the stone would not shift inside the wrapping. Some families used canvas as an outer wrapping layer over wool. The canvas was more durable and less likely to be damaged by repeated use. The wool next to the stone absorbed some heat and created a buffer layer. The canvas on the outside protected the wool and made the wrapped stone easier to handle and position. The teaching of children to manage heated stones safely was an important part of frontier child rearing. Young children might start by simply fetching stones in the morning after they had cooled, learning to identify which stones were the heating stones and where they were kept. As they grew older, they might be allowed to place cool stones into the fire in the evening, learning the proper placement technique. Only older children, judged to be responsible and careful, would be trusted with the actual wrapping and placement of hot stones. This progression of responsibility reflected broader patterns in how children learned prairie survival skills. Each task had its hazards, and children were introduced to them gradually under supervision, with clear instruction about what could go wrong. The heated stone was an ideal teaching tool because the dangers were clear and immediate, a burn from improper handling, while the benefits were also obvious and appreciated. The wrapped stone was tested before being placed in the bedding. A hand held briefly near the wrapping could assess whether it was too hot. If the wrapping felt uncomfortably warm even without direct contact, it needed more cloth layers. If it felt only moderately warm, it was probably wrapped too thickly and would not provide adequate heat. The right balance was a wrapping that felt quite warm to the touch but did not cause immediate discomfort. Placement of the stone within the bed was usually at the foot, where it could warm feet. Cold feet were one of the most common complaints during winter sleeping. Feet, being far from the body's core and having less muscle mass to generate heat, cooled quickly. A warm stone at the feet prevented this cooling and contributed to overall body comfort. Some families positioned the stone near children rather than near adults. Children's smaller bodies had less thermal mass and lost heat more quickly. A heated stone near a child's torso or feet helped maintain their warmth through the night. Adults, with larger bodies and more metabolic heat production, were better able to stay warm without the stone's assistance. Alternative heat storage methods developed in situations where suitable stones weren't available. Some pioneers used heated bricks if they had access to clay and a kiln. Bricks worked well, they were uniform in size, predictable in their heating characteristics, and safe. But bricks were rarely available on the open prairie. In regions with brick buildings, families sometimes negotiated to borrow bricks for heating purposes. Other objects tried as stone substitutes included cast iron implements, flat irons used for pressing clothes could be heated and wrapped, but cast iron cooled faster than stone and posed greater burn risks if wrapping failed. Some desperate families tried heating large metal cans filled with hot water, but these were prone to leaking and created dangerous steam if overfilled. The stone's warmth lasted for hours, but it was not constant. The heat release followed a curve, hotter at first, gradually cooling through the night. The first hour after placement was often almost uncomfortably warm. The middle hours provided steady, pleasant warmth. By the final hours before dawn, the stone might be barely warmer than the surrounding environment. But even this residual warmth was beneficial, especially during the coldest part of the night, which typically occurred in the hours just before sunrise. In the morning, the stone was cool or only slightly warm. It was unwrapped and set aside, ready to be used again the following night. The cloth wrappings were checked for burn marks or damage. Any cloth that had been scorched was retired from stone wrapping duty because weakened fabric might fail during the next use, potentially allowing the hot stone to come into contact with blankets or skin. The heated stone was a simple technology, but it was also elegant. It required no specialized equipment beyond what was readily available. Rocks, fire, cloth. It could be implemented by anyone, from the poorest traveller to the most established homesteader. It was reliable and repeatable, and it worked. On a cold night, the presence of that wrapped stone at the foot of the bed was the difference between restless, uncomfortable sleep and genuine rest. The practice continued as long as people slept in unheated spaces. Even after pioneers moved from wagons to homes, the heated stone remained useful. A bedroom in a sod house might be above freezing but still uncomfortably cold. A heated stone in the bed made that coldness tolerable. The technique only became obsolete when homes could be heated throughout, or when manufactured products like hot water bottles became available and affordable. Banking for morning. The concept of banking a fire, preserving coals overnight, was fundamental to prairie life. It represented not just a practical skill, but a particular relationship with fire. Fire was not something to be created anew each time it was needed. It was something to be maintained, kept alive, carried forward from day to day. The technique of banking was simple in principle but required practice to execute reliably. The fire had to be burned down to coals first. This meant letting the flames die and the wood or other fuel consume until only glowing embers remained. Coals were the goal. These provided steady heat without flames, and they burned much more slowly than flaming wood. Once the fire had reached the coal stage, ash was heaped on top. The ash came from the fire itself, the accumulated residue of previous burning. Ash was always present around a fire pit, and pioneers were careful not to discard it entirely. Some ash was always kept nearby because it was needed for banking. The amount of ash required depended on the quantity of coals and the length of time they needed to be preserved. For an overnight banking, roughly 8 to 10 hours, a layer of ash several inches thick was appropriate. This layer could be built up gradually, adding ash in stages and observing the effect on the coal's glow. Ash served to restrict the oxygen supply to coals. Fire requires oxygen to burn. Coals, which are still burning in a controlled way, also require oxygen. By covering coals with ash, the oxygen supply was restricted but not eliminated entirely. Some air could still reach the coals through the porous ash layer. This small amount of oxygen allowed the coals to continue burning, but at a dramatically reduced rate. A properly banked fire appeared dead. The surface showed only grey ash with no visible glow or heat shimmer. But beneath that ash layer, the coals remained alive. They were hot, sometimes as hot as 500 degrees or more, but they were burning so slowly that they might lose only a fraction of their mass over the course of the night. The banking process was typically one of the last tasks before sleep. After the evening meal, after the ground sheets and the bedding were laid, after the heated stones were wrapped and positioned, someone, usually the adult man if a family group or whoever was assigned that evening's fire duty in a wagon train, would bank the fire. It was a responsibility, something that had to be done correctly because mistakes would be discovered too late to fix. A fire banked too lightly, with insufficient ash, would burn through the night and be extinguished by morning. The family would wake to a cold fire pit with nothing but grey, lifeless ash. Starting a new fire from scratch would be necessary, adding significant time and difficulty to the morning routine. A fire banked too heavily, with too much ash or with ash packed too densely, might smother the coals completely. They would be extinguished by the lack of oxygen. The result would be the same, a dead fire in the morning and the need to start anew. The correct balance left coals that were still alive at dawn. These coals might not be visibly glowing on their surface. They might be covered with a layer of their own ash that had formed during the slow overnight burn, but when disturbed they would reveal red heat underneath. Morning fire revival was a reversal of the banking process. The first person awake would approach the banked fire site. Using a stick or a small shovel, they would carefully dig into the ash pile, moving material aside to expose the coals beneath. The ash was not discarded, it was simply pushed to the sides, because some of it would be needed for banking the next night. Once the coals were exposed, the first addition was tinder. This was the finest, most easily ignitable material available. Dry grass, shredded bark, small twigs, or even paper if available. The tinder was placed directly onto the glowing coals. Then came the critical step, adding oxygen. The fire starter would blow gently on the coals and tinder. This increased airflow accomplished two things. It brought more oxygen into contact with the hot coals, causing them to burn more actively and produce more heat. And it directed hot air upward through the tinder, raising its temperature to the ignition point. Within seconds, if done correctly, the tinder would begin to smoke, then to smoulder, then to flame. Once flames appeared, the fire starter would continue to blow gently, while adding more tinder to feed the growing flame. Small twigs came next, ranged in a loose pyramid to allow airflow. As these caught, progressively larger pieces of fuel were added. The entire process, from exposing the banked coals to having a functioning fire, could take less than a minute. This speed was remarkable compared to the alternative of starting from scratch with flint and steel, which might take 5 or 10 minutes or longer, especially in cold conditions when hands were stiff and tinder might be slightly damp. The reliability of banked coals was high but not perfect. Weather could affect the outcome. A night of heavy rain, if water seeped into the fire pit, could extinguish coals despite proper banking. Extremely cold temperatures, while they did not directly extinguish coals, could cause them to burn faster, as the surrounding cold air created stronger convection currents that pulled more oxygen through the ash layer. Wind was particularly challenging. A banking that worked well on a calm night might fail on a windy night, because wind forced more air through the ash layer, causing the coals to burn more actively and consume themselves before morning. Experienced fire tenders learned to compensate for expected wind by adding extra ash, or by creating a wind block around the fire pit using rocks or equipment. The psychological comfort of successfully banked coals extended beyond the practical benefit of easy morning fire starting. The presence of those preserved coals represented continuity. The fire had not died. It had been maintained, kept alive, carried forward. This continuity was symbolically important in an environment where much was unpredictable and temporary. Fire was also a link to civilization, to human presence and activity. In the vast darkness of the prairie night, with no artificial lights for miles in any direction, the knowledge that coals were still glowing, even if hidden beneath ash, was reassuring. It meant the fire, that most fundamental human tool, remained available. It meant that warmth and light could be reclaimed quickly when needed. The practice of fire banking was taught from parent to child. It was one of the essential skills that children learned as they grew. A child old enough to be trusted near the fire would be shown how to add ash, how to judge the correct amount, how to test the banking by observing the coal's behaviour. Mastery of this skill was a marker of competence, a sign that a young person was learning the practical knowledge necessary for prairie life. Some pioneers became expert at fire management, developing a reputation within their wagon train or community for their ability to keep fires going through any conditions. These individuals might be asked to bank the fire when weather was particularly challenging, or when circumstances meant that fire could not be allowed to fail. Their knowledge was valued and respected. The banking technique also had applications beyond overnight preservation. Fires might be banked during the day if a family or group needed to travel for several hours but wanted to maintain fire continuity. The fire would be heavily banked in the morning, then the travellers would move to their next location. Upon arrival, the banked coals would be transported in a metal container, then uncovered and used to start the fire at the new camp. This allowed fire to be physically moved across distances without extinguishing it. Elevation as luxury. For pioneers who moved beyond constant travel and established homesteads, one of the first improvements to sleeping arrangements was elevation. The difference between sleeping directly on the ground and sleeping even a few inches above it was substantial. This elevation came most commonly in the form of a straw-tick mattress. The transition from traveller to homesteader was gradual but significant. It began when a family stopped moving and claimed a piece of land. This claiming might be through the Homestead Act, which offered land in exchange for cultivation, or through purchase, or through squatting in areas where land law was unclear or unenforced. Regardless of the legal mechanism, the decision to stop travelling and begin farming marked a fundamental shift in how the family lived. The first months of homesteading were often the hardest. The family had to build shelter, establish a water source, begin breaking ground for crops, and somehow survive until the first harvest. During this period, sleeping arrangements were minimal, often nothing more than bedrolls on the ground inside a crude dugout or tent. The focus was on more urgent survival needs. But once the first harvest was complete, once wheat or corn or other crops had been successfully grown and gathered, the family had resources that had not been available during travel. They had straw, the waste product of grain cultivation. They had time, because winter's arrival limited outdoor work, and they had motivation, because the prospect of spending an entire winter sleeping on cold ground was unbearable. The straw tick was, in its simplest form, a large fabric bag. It was sewn from ticking, a tightly woven fabric designed to contain straw or other filling without allowing the material to poke through. Ticking was usually made from cotton or linen, woven with a twill pattern that created a strong, durable fabric. The fabric could be purchased at general stores or trading posts if available, or it could be woven at home if the family had a loom and the necessary skills. Purchased ticking was more uniform and often stronger, but it was expensive. Homemade ticking was more variable in quality, but could be produced from materials on hand. The dimensions of a tick varied based on who would sleep on it and what materials were available. A family tick might be large enough to accommodate multiple people sleeping side by side, perhaps 6 feet wide and 7 feet long. A single person's tick would be smaller, perhaps 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. The tick was left open on one end, with this opening reinforced with extra stitching to prevent tearing during use. The construction of the tick was straightforward sewing. The sides and bottom were seamed, usually with a flat-felled seam that enclosed the raw edges and prevented fraying. The open end was hemmed to reinforce it. Some tick makers added internal stitching that divided the tick into channels or sections, preventing the filling from shifting entirely to one end. These channels were optional but improved the tick's performance. The filling for the tick came from the farm itself, once a homesteader had completed a harvest. Straw was the most common material, the dried stems of wheat, oats, or other grain crops after the edible seed heads had been removed. This straw was a byproduct of farming, abundant wherever grain was grown. It had no other high-value use, making it ideal for bedding. The quality of straw varied depending on the crop and the harvest conditions. Wheat straw was generally preferred because it was relatively soft and flexible. Oat straw was somewhat coarser. Barley straw was prickly and less comfortable. The straw had to be dry. Wet or damp straw would mould inside the tick, creating odours and potentially health problems. Corn husks were another option. After corn was harvested and the kernels removed, the dry husks could be used to stuff a tick. Corn husk ticks were somewhat less comfortable than straw ticks because the husks were coarser and less flexible, but they were still preferable to sleeping directly on the floor. The husks had to be completely dry and were best used after they had been aged for several weeks post-harvest. Some families experimented with other filling materials. Dried leaves from deciduous trees could be used if available, though they tended to fragment quickly. Dried grass was occasionally used but compressed too easily to be effective. Cattail down, where cattails grew, made excellent filling but was time-consuming to gather in sufficient quantity. Most families defaulted to straw or corn husks as the most practical options. The process of filling a tick was straightforward but required some effort. The empty tick was taken to the barn or to wherever the straw or husks were stored. The material was gathered in armfuls and stuffed through the open end of the tick. The goal was to pack the tick firmly enough that it provided support, but not so tightly that the material compacted into an uncomfortable, unyielding mass. A well-filled tick had some give to it. It compressed somewhat under body weight, conforming slightly to the sleeper's shape. This was more comfortable than a perfectly flat, hard surface, but the tick should not compress so much that the sleeper ended up essentially on the floor anyway. Finding the right balance was a matter of experience, learned through trial and error. The filling process was often a family activity. Children could help gather straw and feed it into the tick's opening. Adults managed the packing, ensuring even distribution and appropriate firmness. The work might take an hour or more for a large tick, less for a smaller one. It was not skilled labour, but it was necessary labour, and the result, a functional mattress, made the effort worthwhile. Once filled, the open end of the tick was closed, usually with a drawstring or with large stitches that could be removed when it was time to replace the filling. The drawstring method was more convenient for regular maintenance. Large stitches were more secure but required cutting and resewing each time the tick was emptied. The tick was then carried to the sleeping area and positioned where it would be used. For a family living in a dugout or early sod house, this might mean simply laying the tick on the earthen floor. For a family that had progressed to a simple bed frame, the tick would be placed on the frame's support ropes or slats. The most important function of the tick was elevation. By raising the sleeper 6 to 8 inches off the floor, the tick created an air gap between body and ground. This gap was critical for temperature management. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which means it acts as insulation. The air trapped beneath the tick, and within the tick's filling provided a buffer between the cold floor and the sleeping person. The difference in comfort was immediate and noticeable. A person who had been sleeping on the floor, even with a good ground sheet, would find that a straw tick changed the quality of their sleep significantly. They would wake less stiff, less cold, and more rested. The constant ache in hips and shoulders from pressure against a hard surface would diminish. The body could finally relax fully during sleep. This improvement in sleep quality had cascading effects on daily life. Better rested people could work more effectively. They had more energy, better focus, and greater resilience to the various stresses of homestead life. The tick was not just a comfort improvement, it was a productivity improvement that helped the entire homesteading enterprise function better. The secondary benefit of the tick was cushioning. Straw and corn husks, while not as soft as modern mattress materials, provided more cushioning than bare floor or even a folded blanket. The body's weight distributed across the tick's surface rather than concentrating on a few pressure points. This made it easier to sleep on one side, which is a common sleeping position, but difficult on hard surfaces. The distribution of pressure was particularly valuable for pregnant women, elderly family members, or anyone with injuries or chronic pain. These individuals found sleeping on hard surfaces especially difficult. The tick provided relief, making sleep possible when it might otherwise have been nearly impossible. The tick did have drawbacks. The most obvious was noise. Every movement resulted in rustling. Rolling over produced a crackling sound as the straw shifted inside the tick. This could be disturbing to sleep, both for the person on the tick and for others sleeping nearby. Families learned to sleep through the noise, but visitors or those new to tick mattresses often found it disruptive at first. The noise was particularly noticeable when multiple people shared a tick. Each person's movements created sound, and the movements of one person could disturb others. Light sleepers found this especially challenging. Some families addressed this by making separate ticks for each person when space and materials allowed, but this was often impractical in small dwellings. The straw or husks inside the tick also broke down over time. Months of being compressed under body weight, of moisture from sleeping bodies, and of simple aging caused the material to fragment. Whole pieces of straw gradually turned into smaller pieces, then into dust. As this happened, the tick lost height and became less effective. It would compress more under a weight, eventually providing minimal elevation. The rate of breakdown depended on several factors. The quality of the original filling material mattered. Fresh, dry, well-cured straw lasted longer than straw that had been damp or poorly stored. The weight of the sleepers affected breakdown rate. Heavier bodies compressed the filling faster. The frequency of use was also a factor. A tick that was slept on every night wore out faster than one used occasionally. This meant that ticks had to be emptied and refilled regularly. The old filling was removed, it could be used as animal bedding or composted, and fresh material was stuffed in. This maintenance was usually done seasonally, after each harvest when new straw or husks were readily available. A family might empty and refill their ticks in late fall, ensuring they would have effective bedding through the winter. The seasonal rhythm of tick maintenance became part of the annual cycle of homestead tasks. It was scheduled around harvest when straw was abundant and dry. It was done before the hardest cold set in, so the family would have good bedding when they most needed it. And it was often done communally, with family members working together to complete the task efficiently. The fabric of the tick also required maintenance. Here, constant shifting of internal material created friction and stress on the seams. Tears could develop, especially at corners or along seams. These had to be repaired promptly, because a tear would allow filling to leak out and would weaken the overall structure. Repairs were usually done by the women of the household, though men might help with heavy seaming or with patches that required strong stitching. The patches were cut from scrap fabric, old clothing, worn linens, leftover ticking. The stitching was utilitarian rather than decorative. What mattered was keeping the tick functional, not making it beautiful. Ticks were not easily portable. Once filled, they were heavy and bulky. A full-size family tick might weigh 30 or 40 pounds when filled with straw, more with corn husks. Moving them was possible but awkward. This was acceptable for homesteaders who had established a permanent or semi-permanent residence. The tick stayed in one location, in one room, and was used night after night. For travellers, ticks were not practical. The weight and bulk made them unsuitable for wagon travel. This immobility marked an important psychological shift. A traveller's bedding was designed to be packed and moved daily. A homesteader's tick was designed to stay in place. This reflected the fundamental difference in lifestyle. Movement versus settlement. Temporary versus permanent. Journey versus destination. In a dugout or sod house, the tick was typically placed directly on the earth floor, often with a canvas or rug beneath it for additional moisture protection. The canvas served the same purpose it had served during travel, blocking ground moisture and providing an additional insulation layer. Some families placed boards under the tick if wood was available, creating an even better barrier against ground cold. In a house with a wooden floor, a luxury most homesteaders aspired to but many did not immediately achieve, the tick rested directly on the boards. The wooden floor itself provided substantial insulation from ground cold, and the tick on top of it created a very comfortable sleeping surface relative to what the family had experienced during their travel and early homesteading. Some families built simple bed frames, wooden platforms raised a foot or two off the floor, which allowed the tick to have even more air circulation beneath it, improving its insulating effectiveness. These frames were usually constructed from rough-cut lumber or from saplings if any trees were accessible. The construction was simple. 4 corner posts, side rails, and either ropes strung in a grid pattern or wooden slats to support the tick. The rope-strung bed frame was a traditional design. Rope was threaded through holes in the frame rails, creating a woven grid. This grid had some give to it, creating a slight springiness that improved comfort. The tick was laid on top of the rope grid. Over time, the ropes would stretch and sag, requiring retightening. This led to the phrase "sleep tight," which originally referred to tightening the bed ropes to improve support. Children often slept on ticks placed on the floor even when adults had proper beds. A family might have one or two bedsteads with rope-strung frames for the parents, while children slept on straw ticks on the floor. This arrangement reflected both practical considerations and family structure. Parents, who bore the responsibility of maintaining the homestead, needed the best sleep they could get to remain productive. Children could manage with simpler arrangements. As homesteads became more established and prosperous, sleeping arrangements improved further. Straw ticks might be replaced with feather ticks, fabric bags filled with feathers rather than straw. Feather ticks were softer, quieter, and more durable than straw ticks, but they were also much more expensive. Feathers had to be saved from domestic fowl over many months, or purchased, making feather ticks an aspiration that might take years to achieve. The transition from straw tick to feather tick marked real prosperity. It meant the family had progressed beyond basic survival. They had established their homestead successfully, had reliable crop production, and had resources to invest in comfort rather than just necessity. The feather tick was a luxury, but it was an achievable luxury, one that represented the reward for years of hard work. The tick, whether filled with straw, corn husks, or eventually feathers, represented progress. It meant a family had stopped moving and started settling. It meant they had completed a harvest and had straw to spare. It meant they had achieved a level of stability that allowed for improvements to daily life. The tick was not luxury in any absolute sense, but it was comfort. Practical, homemade comfort that made winter nights measurably better. This comfort should not be understated. After months or years of sleeping on hard ground or floors, the elevation and cushioning provided by even a simple straw tick was transformative. It changed how people felt about going to bed. Instead of dreading the discomfort of lying down, they could look forward to the relative ease of sleeping on the tick. This psychological shift was as important as the physical improvement. The ritual before sleep. Sleep on the prairie did not simply happen, it was prepared for. Every evening, as daylight faded and temperatures dropped, a series of tasks had to be completed. These tasks were not optional. They were the foundation of a night spent in relative warmth and safety. The ritual before sleep was as important as sleep itself. The ritual varied by circumstance. Wagon travelers, cowboys, and homesteaders each had their own versions, but the underlying principle was constant. Evening preparation determined nighttime survival. Neglecting any step meant discomfort at best and danger at worst. The ritual was learned through experience, refined through repetition, and passed from experienced pioneers to newcomers. The first task was choosing the sleeping location. For wagon travelers, this meant positioning the wagon appropriately. The wagon would be placed with its back to the prevailing wind, usually the north. This positioning created a wind shadow on the wagon's leeward side where the family would sleep. If the wagon train was forming a corral, each wagon's position was predetermined by its place in the circle, but even within that formation, attention was paid to wind direction. The wagon train's evening assembly was a coordinated process. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the wagon master would signal the day's travel to end. The lead wagon would begin to turn, and subsequent wagons would follow in a curving path until they formed a rough circle. The process took 15 to 20 minutes for a train of moderate size. Each family knew their position in the circle and moved into place without needing detailed direction. Once the circle was complete, there was a period of adjustment. Wagons were repositioned slightly to eliminate gaps. The corral needed to be secure enough to contain livestock overnight. Families checked their neighbours' positioning and helped adjust as needed. This communal effort created not just a physical enclosure but a sense of shared security. For cowboys on the open range, location choice meant finding any available feature that might offer wind protection. The chuck wagon was preferred, though competition for these spots was understood without being openly discussed. Cowboys would gravitate toward preferred locations as evening approached, establishing position through presence. If no wagon was available, the cowboy looked for any low rise, any cluster of brush, any cattle grouped in a way that might block wind. Homesteaders had less choice in sleeping location. They slept in their dwelling, whether dugout or sod house, but they still had evening preparation tasks. The door needed to be secured against wind. Gaps around the single window needed to be stuffed with cloth or paper. The stove needed to be positioned and fueled. The sleeping area needed to be swept and arranged. The ground itself required attention regardless of sleeping situation. The sleeping site needed to be relatively flat. A slope could be managed if necessary, but sleeping on a significant incline was uncomfortable. The sleeper would constantly fight gravity, sliding downward, waking repeatedly to adjust position. A flat site was preferred, or at worst a very gentle slope that could be managed by positioning the body perpendicular to the slope. The assessment of flatness was done both visually and by feel. A site that looked flat might reveal subtle slopes when tested by lying down briefly. Experienced pioneers learned to judge slope accurately at a glance, but they still confirmed by testing. A few minutes spent finding the best sleeping position saved hours of discomfort during the night. The ground was inspected for rocks, sticks, or other objects that might create pressure points. These were removed. Even a small rock beneath the hip or shoulder could make sleep impossible. The inspection was usually done by hand, kneeling and feeling across the surface where bedding would be laid. In darkness, this tactile inspection was necessary because objects might not be visible. The thoroughness of this inspection varied by how long the site would be used. For a single night's camp, a quick check and removal of obvious objects might suffice. For a location where a wagon train would camp for several days, or for a homesteader preparing a permanent sleeping area, the inspection would be more detailed. Every pebble, every twig would be cleared away. Once the site was prepared, the ground sheet was laid. The ground sheet was positioned carefully, with its edges weighted or tucked to prevent wind from getting underneath. If sleeping beneath a wagon, the ground sheet's edges might be secured under the wagon's wheels or frame. If sleeping in the open, rocks or equipment were placed on the edges. The method of securing the ground sheet varied by available materials and conditions. Rocks were most common, smooth river rocks if available, any rocks otherwise. Equipment such as cooking pots, water containers or tools could also serve as weights. The key was to ensure the ground sheet would not shift during the night, even if wind picked up. Next came the layers of bedding. If there was a tick, it was placed on the ground sheet. If not, blankets were laid directly on the ground sheet, with the heaviest blanket on the bottom to provide maximum insulation from ground cold. Additional blankets were arranged in order, with the configuration depending on how many people would share the bed. The ordering of blankets was not random. Each family developed their own system based on experience and available materials. The heaviest, thickest blanket went on bottom. Lighter wool blankets were layered in the middle. The top layer might be a quilt if the family had one, because quilts stayed in place better than loose blankets. This ordering maximised warmth and minimised gaps. For a family sleeping together, the arrangement was strategic. The largest adults positioned themselves on the outside edges, creating windbreaks for smaller family members. Children were placed in the centre, where they would benefit from warmth on both sides. Blankets were arranged so that they could be pulled up over everyone, creating a shared cover. The positioning of family members was also determined by who was most likely to need to rise during the night. An adult who would need to tend the fire or check on animals would position themselves on the outside for easier exit. Children who might wake during the night would be placed where parents could easily reach them. These considerations became automatic through repeated practice. The fire, which had been burning for hours, was now managed for night. If the ground heating technique was being used, the fire was scraped aside and the bedding laid on the warm earth. If heated stones were ready, they were wrapped and positioned. The remaining coals were banked with ash, carefully covered to preserve them until morning. The fire management was a critical moment in the evening ritual. It required coordination. Someone had to manage the fire while others prepared bedding. The timing had to be right. The fire scraped aside early enough that the ground could be safely used, but late enough that it remained warm. The banking had to be done properly, with the right amount of ash applied in the right way. Animals were checked. For wagon travellers, this meant ensuring oxen or mules were securely tethered or corralled. Livestock could wander during the night, and losing animals meant losing the ability to continue the journey. Animals also needed to be positioned where they had access to grazing or fodder, but not where they could damage equipment or disturb sleepers. The checking of animals was thorough. Each animal was visually inspected for signs of injury or illness. Ropes or tethers were tested for security. Water access was confirmed. Fodder was provided if the animals were confined. This process took time but was essential. The animals were the engine of travel, and their welfare determined whether the family could continue their journey. For cowboys, checking the herd was part of the work rotation. The cattle needed to be settled for the night, bedded down in a location where they would remain calm. The night guards were assigned their shifts, each man knowing when he would need to wake, ride, and return to sleep. The herd's position relative to the camp was noted, close enough for guards to reach quickly, but far enough that cattle sounds wouldn't disturb sleeping cowboys unnecessarily. Footwear received attention. Boots were removed but kept close, positioned within arm's reach just outside the bedding area. They had to be immediately accessible in case of need. A stampede, a predator, a sudden storm, but not so close that they might be kicked during sleep. The removal of boots was often accompanied by a brief foot inspection. Blisters needed to be checked. Socks needed to be examined for holes. Feet needed to be dried if they had become damp during the day. This attention to feet was not luxury. It was maintenance of a critical body part. Foot problems could prevent walking or riding, making a person useless on the trail. Clothing was usually kept on, especially in cold weather. Removing clothing meant losing the warmth those layers had accumulated during the day. It also meant vulnerability. If something required immediate action, being dressed meant being ready. The clothing worn to sleep was often the same clothing worn during the day, minus only outer layers like coats or vests that might be used as additional covering. The decision of what clothing to remove varied by temperature and personal preference. On moderate nights, some pioneers might remove outer shirts or loosen collars for comfort. On very cold nights, everything stayed on, buttoned up, sealed tight. The clothing became part of the insulation system, working with blankets to trap body heat. Hats were positioned carefully. For cowboys, the hat was often placed over the face to block light and create warmth around the mouth and nose. For others, the hat might be set aside near the head, where it could be quickly retrieved in the morning. Hats were valuable. They protected from sun, rain and cold, and were not left where they might blow away or be damaged. The care given to hats reflected their importance. A good hat was expensive and difficult to replace on the trail or on an isolated homestead. The hat was cleaned of dust before being stored for the night. It was positioned where morning dew or frost would not reach it. It was protected from being stepped on or sat on accidentally. Weapons, if carried, were kept accessible. This was particularly true in the earlier years of prairie settlement, when the risk of conflict was higher. A firearm might be placed under the edge of a ground sheet, or between layers of bedding where it would remain dry but could be reached quickly. The practice continued even as the frontier became more settled. A habit formed in more dangerous times. The positioning of weapons was done discreetly without discussion or display. The weapon was simply placed where it would be accessible, then covered. This discretion reflected both practical concerns, advertising weapon locations was unwise, and social norms that discouraged overt displays of armed preparedness even when such preparedness was common. Personal items were secured. Anything that needed to remain dry was placed inside the wagon, if one was available, or wrapped in oilcloth if sleeping in the open. Valuables, money, documents, pocket watches were kept on the person or in secure locations. The prairie was vast and things lost in darkness were often lost permanently. The securing of valuables was done matter-of-factly but carefully. Important documents might be wrapped in oilcloth and placed in an inner pocket. Money might be distributed among multiple pockets or hiding places rather than kept in a single location. These precautions were not paranoid. They were practical responses to the reality that loss or the theft could have serious consequences. The final act was settling into the bedding. This was done carefully to avoid disturbing the arrangement of layers. Adults entered from the sides. Children were often placed in position first, then covered. The blankets were pulled up and tucked around the group, with attention paid to eliminating gaps where cold air might enter. The process of getting into bed was a learned skill. New pioneers might clumsily disarrange the carefully prepared layers. Experienced travellers slipped into position smoothly, maintaining the integrity of the bedding. Children were taught to move deliberately, to avoid kicking or pulling blankets out of position. The entire family coordinated their movements to preserve the warmth-trapping configuration. Once everyone was in place, there might be a few moments of adjustment. Shifting position to find comfort. arranging an arm that had nowhere comfortable to rest, finding the right spot for a head that lacked a pillow. Prairie sleep did not offer the instant comfort of a modern bed. It required the body to adapt to the available conditions. These adjustments were expected and accepted. A minute or two of small movements was normal. Bodies settled into place, breathing synchronized. The day's tension began to release. The transition from wakefulness to sleep approached. Some families said prayers before sleep. Others simply settled into silence. Occasionally there was quiet conversation, discussion of travel, plans for tomorrow, concerns about weather or supplies. But mostly there was the sound of wind, the distant sounds of livestock, and the gradual quieting of human movement as sleep approached. The content of evening conversations varied by circumstances. Wagon train families might discuss the trail ahead, speculate about when they would reach their destination, share observations about other families in the train. Homesteaders might talk about crops, building projects, seasonal planning. Cowboys might review the day's work, discuss the herd's condition, or simply sit in companionable silence. The ritual before sleep was not romantic. It was work. But it was work that provided security. Each step had been learned, often through cold and uncomfortable nights when something had been done wrong or omitted. The ritual represented collective knowledge, passed from experienced travellers to newcomers, refined over years of prairie living. It was the difference between a night of rest and a night of miserable wakefulness. The teaching of this ritual to children and newcomers was ongoing and mostly informal. Children watched their parents and imitated their actions. New members of a wagon train observed experienced travellers and asked questions. Mistakes were made, but they were instructive mistakes, teaching through direct experience what worked and what did not. Over time, the ritual became automatic, requiring no conscious thought, just a series of familiar actions that prepared the body and mind for sleep. The victory of morning. Morning on the prairie came slowly. The darkness before dawn was deep and cold, the coldest part of the entire night. Temperatures that had dropped through evening and midnight reached their lowest point in the hours just before sunrise. This was when frost was heaviest, when breath became visible clouds, when even the best bedding felt insufficient. The first person to wake, usually an adult, occasionally a child who could no longer sleep, faced a choice. They could remain in the bedding, staying warm, but accomplishing nothing, or they could emerge and begin the work of bringing the camp back to life. Remaining in bed was tempting. The air outside the blankets was brutally cold, but staying meant everyone else would remain cold too. Someone had to restart the fire. The emergence from bedding was a moment of determination. The person who woke first would move carefully to avoid disturbing others who were still sleeping. They would extract themselves from the shared warmth, feeling the immediate shock of cold air against their body. Their breath would form clouds. Their skin would prickle with the temperature change. Boots were found and pulled on. Frozen leather was stiff and difficult. Laces might be stiff with frost. But the boots were necessary. The ground was cold, sometimes covered with frost or a thin layer of snow. Walking without footwear was painful and potentially dangerous. The banked fire became the immediate focus. The person would approach the ash-covered pile, kneel beside it, and begin to dig. A stick or a small shovel moved ash aside, exposing the coals beneath. If the banking had been successful, those coals would still be alive, perhaps not visibly glowing on the surface, but red and hot just beneath a thin layer of their own ash. The sight of those preserved coals was reassuring. It meant the night's preparation had worked. It meant fire had survived. The work of revival could begin immediately. Tinder was gathered. Dry grass, small twigs, anything that would ignite easily. This material was placed directly onto the exposed coals. Then came the breath. Kneeling close to the fire pit, the person would blow gently onto the coals and tinder. The airflow brought oxygen into contact with heat. Within moments, smoke would appear. Then a glow would spread through the tinder. Then, with continued gentle blowing, flame would emerge. The appearance of that first flame was significant. It was not just fire, it was the return of warmth, of light, of the capacity to cook and to heat water. It was the transition from night's dormancy to day's activity. The person tending the fire would continue to add tinder, then small twigs, building the flame gradually until it was strong enough to accept larger fuel. As the fire grew, its warmth began to radiate outward. The person tending it could hold their hands near the flames, bringing sensation back to numb fingers. The light from the fire illuminated the immediate area, making other tasks easier. The sound of crackling wood or burning buffalo chips was a familiar, comforting sound. Other sleepers would begin to stir as the fire's warmth and light reached them. Children might remain buried in blankets, reluctant to face the cold. Adults would emerge gradually, one at a time, each moving to the fire to warm themselves before beginning their own morning tasks. Water had to be obtained for coffee and breakfast. If there was a stream or creek nearby, it might be frozen, requiring breaking through. Ice to reach liquid water. If snow was available, it could be melted, though this required time and fuel. If the family had preserved water from the previous evening, it might be partially frozen in its container, requiring thawing before use. Breakfast preparation began as soon as the fire was adequate. This was usually a simple meal: cooked grain, perhaps some salted meat, coffee if supplies allowed. The goal was to provide warmth and energy for the day's work or travel ahead. Cooking was done in cast iron pots or pans placed directly on the fire, or on a small grill if available. While breakfast cooked, bedding was gathered and packed. Blankets were shaken to remove any frost or debris. They were folded or rolled according to how they would be stored, in a wagon, in a bedroll, or inside a dwelling. The ground sheet was checked for damage and folded. Any heated stones from the night before were unwrapped, the cloth wrappings inspected and set aside for reuse. The morning light revealed the night's effects. Frost covered everything: the ground, the wagon covers, any exposed equipment. The frost was beautiful in its way, millions of tiny ice crystals reflecting the early light. But it was also a reminder of how cold the night had been, how close everything was to freezing. Livestock needed attention. Animals that had been corralled or tethered overnight needed water and fodder. Their health was checked. Any signs of injury or illness had to be addressed. For cowboys, the cattle herd needed to be roused and prepared for the day's drive. For wagon travellers, oxen or mules needed to be harnessed for the day's journey. The camp or sleeping area was inspected and tidied. Any items that had been left out overnight were gathered. The fire pit was managed. Some coals might be preserved for the midday meal, or the fire might be fully extinguished if the group was moving to a new location. Ashes were spread or buried, reducing fire danger if dry grass was present. Gradually the camp transitioned from the stillness of night to the activity of day. Voices rose, tools were gathered, wagons were loaded, horses were saddled. The pattern that had been suspended by sleep resumed, but the night had left its mark, in stiff muscles, in tired eyes, in the persistent cold that took hours to fully shake off. For those who had survived the night in relative comfort, waking to frost-covered morning was not dramatic. It was ordinary. It was what happened every winter morning on the prairie. The cold was expected, the frost was normal. The ritual of fire starting and breakfast preparation was routine. But routine did not mean easy. Each morning required the same effort, the same sequence of tasks, the same determination to face cold air and begin work. The victory of morning was not in comfort. There was little comfort to be found. The victory was in waking, in function, in the ability to continue. For homesteaders who had progressed to living in dugouts or sod houses, the morning experience was different, but not entirely separate from the experiences of travellers. They woke in a more protected space, but that space was still cold. The fire in the stove had gone out overnight despite careful banking. The walls kept out wind but did not provide warmth. The first person awake faced the same task: rekindling fire, bringing warmth back to the dwelling. The satisfaction of successfully navigating another night was quiet. It was not celebrated or remarked upon. It was simply the foundation for the day ahead. The night had been survived. The cold had been managed. The fire had been preserved and rekindled. These small victories accumulated over weeks and months, becoming the texture of prairie life. In letters home, pioneers sometimes mentioned the cold, the difficulty of sleeping, the challenge of staying warm. But more often they focused on other matters: the distance travelled, the health of the animals, the prospects for good land. The nightly struggle with cold was so constant, so repetitive, that it became background, something that did not merit detailed description because it was simply life as they knew it. Modern readers might find this silence puzzling. The conditions seem harsh enough to warrant constant comment. But for those living through it, the cold was not exceptional, it was expected. Complaining about it served no purpose. Enduring it, managing it, learning to sleep despite it, these were necessary skills, and once learned they became automatic. The morning after a particularly cold night might bring relief simply in the knowledge that it had been survived. If the temperature had dropped to unprecedented lows, if a blue norther had arrived unexpectedly, if the wind had blown with unusual force, these nights tested the limits of preparation and endurance. Waking after such a night, finding everyone in the family or the wagon train alive and functional was cause for quiet gratitude. But most mornings were not that dramatic. Most mornings were simply cold, and the people who woke to them were simply tired, and they simply began the work of another day. The victory was in the repetition, in the ability to do this not once but hundreds of times. The victory was in ordinary endurance, sustained night after night through the long prairie winter. Thank you for staying with this story through the cold nights, through the wind and the silence, through the small acts of preservation and care. The pioneers who slept on the frozen prairie were not heroes in the dramatic sense. They were people doing what was necessary, one night at a time. Their sleep was earned, their warmth was built, and their morning was always a beginning rather than an end. Rest well.